Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome back to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're drifting gently towards sleep, listening with headphones on a quiet walk, or filling the early hours before dawn, this space is yours. Because tonight, we descend into one of the oldest and darkest riddles in the human story why our ancestors once turned on their own for meat. This is cinematic history for curious minds who like their science slow and their stories deep. There is an untold chapter in the human saga buried beneath 1.5 million years of dust and silence. It is not a myth or metaphor, but a reality written in fractured bone and ancient teeth. But this is not the tale you expect. It does not begin with cruelty. It begins with hunger. Oh, and if you're someone who finds comfort in long-form, thoughtful videos, look just below this video and you'll see a button that says subscribe. Tap or press it, it's free, you can unsubscribe anytime, and that little bell icon next to it will gently let you know when new stories arrive. Subscribing is what keeps this channel alive. Without it, we simply can't make more. I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? If you'd like, share it in the comments. A quiet reminder that across time zones and continents, we are all here together. And you know, if sleep finds you, that's perfectly fine. The chapters are all in the description below. Now, let us begin with a jawbone left in the dust. There is a bone, long buried, weathered not by time alone but by teeth, incisors, molars, perhaps canines, marks unmistakable in their quiet horror. It is not the tooth of a lion, nor the crushing molar of a hyena. It is human, or something like human. The jawbone, unearthed in the ancient sediments of Kubifora in Kenya, bears the signature of consumption, not by accident, not by animal, but by another of its kind. One ancestor feeding upon another, long before the word ancestor carried the weight it does now. This is not metaphor, nor exaggeration, nor myth. It is evidence, a remnant of an act that, even today, chills the spine not because it is alien, but because it is too familiar. What does it mean, then, when the earliest confirmed case of human cannibalism dates back not hundreds, not thousands, but over 1.5 million years? The question cuts deeper than bone, because this is not the story of monsters. It is the story of us, stripped of tools, language, and ethics. What remains? What are we in the absence of plenty? And what does a chewed jawbone say about the minds and lives of those who walked long before morality had a name? The discovery was not heralded with trumpets or headlines. It began, as many of these stories do, with the patient rhythm of brush against earth. In the shifting heat of the Turkana Basin, archaeologists have long worked to unearth the bones of early hominins. Kubifora, perched at the northeastern edge of Lake Turkana, is a fossil graveyard of profound importance, its layers holding the secrets of nearly 2 million years of prehistory. It is a land of silence and stone, where time seems to have folded in upon itself, preserving moments so old they resist even imagination. And in one of those layers, somewhere between the ancient pulses of a lakebed mud and ashful sediment, lay a mandible, human in form, marked by violence. At first it seemed like any number of other finds in the region, another fossil from the lineage of Homo erectus, or one of its relatives. But closer examination told a stranger tale. The surface of the bone was scored, not by the slow grinding of earth or the careless scrape of excavation tools, but by incisions sharp and deliberate. Linear grooves clustered in patterns, tooth marks, cracks in the cortical surface suggesting percussion, the kind inflicted when marrow is sought. The bone had been processed, not left to rot or buried with reverence. It had been defleshed, fractured, perhaps even roasted. The site offered no clear burial pit, no arrangement of ceremonial placement. This was not ritual, it was practical, a decision made not in contemplation, but in need. And that need, fossilized into action, left a record more honest than any spoken confession. What does it reveal about the hands that held that jawbone, or the hunger behind their eyes? Because hunger, in its purest form, is not poetic. It is not moral, it is not rational, it is pressure. It is the tightening coil of necessity, drawn slow and relentless, until all pretense gives way to instinct. And instinct, under the weight of desperation, writes its own laws. Somewhere, perhaps near that dry ancient riverbed where the mandible was abandoned, a body had stopped breathing. Perhaps it died of thirst, of weakness, of wounds left untended in a world without aid. But the body did not lie untouched. It became, instead, an answer to a question no one wishes to ask out loud. When survival is no longer certain, what becomes permissible? At Cubifora, the sediment does not whisper, it accuses. The layers of compacted earth tell of dramatic shifts in ecology, of long droughts broken by erratic floods. The terrain during the lower Pleistocene was both lush and cruel, an ecosystem in flux. Hominins walked alongside crocodiles, antelope, ancient elephants. Predators circled endlessly, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and others now vanished. And yet, in this thicket of tooth and claw, the greatest threat may have come from within, for it was not only prey animals whose bones bore signs of butchery. The clues etched into that human jaw matched, with eerie precision, the same mark seen on butchered gazelle. What happens when those we love begin to resemble food? The bone itself was catalogued, photographed, passed between hands with gloves and hushed voices. Its designation in the records was clinical, but those who studied it knew they were staring at something uncomfortably intimate. Cannibalism is not rare in nature. Many species resort to it under duress: spiders, fish, rodents. And among primates, it has been observed in pockets, particularly when resources collapse. But in humans, or proto-humans, it bears a weight that is not merely biological. It tugs at the edges of what we think makes us unique. Were the tooth marks made by a stranger, a rival, a grieving kin trying to survive one more night? These are questions without clear answers, yet they haunt the archaeological record like smoke without fire. How do we distinguish necessity from cruelty when both are carved with the same stone? This find, unearthed, analysed, debated, would soon be recognised as the earliest known evidence of human ancestors consuming their own. Not as myth, but as fact. The reality was difficult to hold, not because of disbelief, but because of how deeply it resonates. It reminds us that beneath the firelight of every ancient hearth there was a choice, and not every choice led to kindness. The tooth impressions on that mandible matched the spacing of Homo erectus dentition. That alone was a revelation. It meant the act had not come from a predator scavenging a human kill. It had come from one of us, one of them, shaped like us, walking upright, with hands capable of creating tools, and a brain already enlarged by the evolutionary march toward awareness. What must it have felt like to be that hungry, to wake in a world without mercy, where every sunrise brings no promise of safety, but a new test of endurance, to feel your limbs weaken, your vision blur, your thoughts narrow to a single point of aching urgency? Hunger is not only a sensation, it is a narrowing of the self. It reduces the world to options, and when options disappear, boundaries blur. The landscape of Cubifora, though vast and open to our modern eyes, would have felt enclosed by limitation to those early walkers. The lake, once full, receding. The prey, once plenty, vanishing. The bones of animals smashed and scattered across the dig sites tell their own tale, a record of diminishing returns. And then, amidst the scatter, the bones of one of their own, not buried, not protected, processed. The archaeologists examining the mandible identified over a dozen distinct marks along its surface. Some were tooth impressions, others incisions from stone tools. The angle, the depth, the repetition, all pointed to the same conclusion. This was not casual gnawing. It was methodical, a body stripped of flesh with the same practiced motion used on antelope, a jaw disarticulated not by accident but with intent. And beside it, other bones, long bones with spiral fractures, a telltale sign of marrow extraction, the use of hammer stones to crack open the shafts. Not a predator's chaos, but a hominin's choice. Why would they do it? That question hovers over every ancient site where such evidence is found. The answer is not always the same, but the pattern persists. Sometimes it is hunger, sometimes it is violence, sometimes it may be something else entirely. Ritual, power, desperation, grief. But at Cubifora, the absence of ceremonial placement, the presence of tool marks, and the anatomical pattern of defleshing all suggest one central force: survival. And yet, the implications reach far beyond the literal, because here is the uncomfortable truth. If Homo erectus consumed its own dead for sustenance, it suggests not merely capability but precedent, a survival strategy passed along the edges of memory. And memory, even before language, carries forward. Actions repeated become habits. Habits shape culture. Could it be that this dark impulse, the readiness to consume another in extremity, was part of our inheritance? Not a flaw in our humanity, but one of its early definitions. If so, it reframes the moral distance we imagine between us and them. It tells us that the first known cannibal was not a wild-eyed anomaly, but perhaps a representative of a wider practice, one we only see in flickering glimpses through sediment and scar. And isn't that the most haunting realization of all? That what we consider unthinkable may have once been unspoken, but understood. The dig site, silent under the desert wind, offers no judgment, only evidence. Stones and bones locked in position, awaiting interpretation. And in that silence, we are left to wonder, not only what they did, but what we might do if faced with the same unbearable emptiness. Because history, especially prehistory, is not a distant stage upon which strange creatures once acted. It is a mirror, buried deep in the soil, fogged by time but still reflecting. At Kubifora, that reflection is hard to look at. The tools recovered from the site, flakes of obsidian, sharpened basalt, worn hand axes, were not weapons of war, but instruments of necessity. Their edges speak of survival, of resourcefulness, of the beginnings of choice, and when used not on animal hide but human skin, they speak of a choice made under extraordinary pressure, a choice that was quiet, a choice that left no story, only scars in bone. Among paleoanthropologists, debates still echo. Was this an isolated act, or one of many? Was the consumed individual a victim of violence or a member of the same group, fallen to illness or age? There are no witness accounts, no campfire tales passed down, only grooves, cracks and burn patterns. And yet those subtle signs, examined under the sterile lights of labs, magnified by scanning electron microscopes, become a kind of forensic whisper. They tell us that someone knelt beside a dead body and saw not a corpse but a means to continue. And that alone is enough to shatter our illusions of early innocence. But isn't it also, in some paradoxical way, a gesture of connection? The same hands that butchered that body also carved tools, shared warmth, protected offspring. These were not monsters. They were ancestors, perhaps even parents. They were part of the same unfolding lineage that would eventually build cities, write myths, paint cathedral ceilings, and look back, stunned, at the shadows from which they emerged. What separates a moment of horror from a foundation of resilience? When researchers mapped the marks on the mandible and compared them with other hominin sites, patterns began to form. Cut marks favoured areas of dense muscle attachment, jawline, cheek, neck. The process was systematic, not erratic. There was understanding even without language. There was knowledge passed hand to hand, eye to eye. The ability to recognise flesh as nourishment. The ability to act on that recognition with precision. But knowledge is not the same as cruelty. And so, we are left with a puzzle. Can there be brutality without intention? Violence without malice? What happens when the act that horrifies us was never meant to? There is no monument at Kubifora, no plaque, no shrine. The winds continue their slow work. The lake rises and falls, indifferent to our reverence or revulsion. But in one small stretch of ground, a story broke the surface. A story older than war, older than gods, older than words. A story that asks us to look at our own reflection, not in triumph, but in truth. How far have we really come, if survival still carves its terms into the soft clay of morality? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that our ancestors ate one another, but that they may have done so without hesitation, without narrative, without shame. Shame, after all, is a function of distance, from the act, from the hunger, from the need. And when that distance collapses, when the body in front of you is the difference between life and extinction, the mind may fall silent. We imagine a moral struggle. We imagine regret. But these are modern comforts. In a world ruled by tooth and fire, survival was not debated. It was enacted. And yet, the very fact that we recoil, that we analyse, that we turn this jawbone over and over in our minds, means that something else has changed. It means we are no longer satisfied with simply knowing what happened. We want to understand why. We want to trace the shape of that decision, from its blunt physicality to its shadow in our collective memory. And memory, once awakened, does not go quietly. The implications of this find at Kubifora ripple far beyond the dig site. It reframes our image of Homo erectus, not as a simple-minded ape on the way to becoming human, but as a being already walking the edge of moral tension, already capable of acts that mirror our darkest instincts and our deepest contradictions. They made tools. They cared for their young. And when needed, they consumed their own. What does that make them? The temptation is to draw lines, to place them firmly on the other side of a chasm we tell ourselves we crossed long ago. But what if that chasm is not so wide? What if it is a thin stream, and we have only just stepped across it? Or worse, what if we still straddle it, one foot in empathy, the other in hunger? There is no singular truth embedded in that chewed jawbone. There is only context. And the context is this. Kubifora, 1.5 million years ago, was a crucible. A place where climate was unstable, where resources were limited, and where survival required adaptability so extreme it rewrote behaviour. It is not a story of evil. It is a story of thresholds. And thresholds once crossed are seldom uncrossed. The hand that lifted that bone, was it trembling? Was it guided by ritual? Was it calm, efficient, resigned? The sediment cannot say. The grooves do not answer. But we, sitting here with our comfort and time, cannot help but ask. Because the story of the first human cannibal is not about monstrosity. It is about mirrors, about the ancient negotiations between desperation and restraint, about how far back the roots of our hunger reach. And as the light fades across the dry lake bed where that jaw was buried, we are left with the stillness of a question. When the body of a fallen kin lay quiet and the fire was dying and the wind carried no promise of tomorrow, what would you have done? To answer that, we must go further back, beyond the fire, beyond the tribe, beyond even the word human. Because there was a time, a vast forgotten span, when the creatures we now call our ancestors walked the earth without language, without story, without shame. They were not beasts, but they were not us. They lived in the in-between, a transitional moment in the great unfolding of life, where instinct was beginning to burn into memory, and memory was beginning to ripple into thought. This was the world of Homo erectus and of Homo antecessor. They moved through the Pleistocene like shadows without names. Their footprints pressed into soft riverbanks and hardened into fossils. Their bones, left behind in caves and floodplains, now sit under glass. But what they felt, what they understood, what they feared, we can only reach for that through fragments. And even in those fragments we glimpse something astonishing. Homo erectus, upright man, was not a creature of myth, but of patience. Emerging over 1.5 million years ago, they wandered further than any hominin before them, walking out of Africa into Asia, into Europe. Their tools were shaped with increasing skill, their fires tended with careful hands. They were the first to tame flame, the first to adapt across vast terrains, and perhaps the first to look into the eyes of their dead and hesitate. Not because of language, not because of belief, but because of something older, a flicker of recognition, the kind that says, "You were like me," and Homo antecessor, that elusive figure carved from the Spanish earth, found at Grandolina, with juvenile bones broken and butchered. Their teeth bore the marks of both growth and violence. A child, maybe 11 years old, consumed by another. The lines between predator and kin, between self and other, dissolve quickly in a world governed by need. What does it mean to be almost human? These early beings had bodies like ours, faces that would not seem alien, hands capable of grasping, crafting, killing. Their brains were large, smaller than ours, yes, but vast compared to what came before. And yet their world was not lit by the inner voices we take for granted. There were no names, no myths, no whispered lullabies or promises held in words, only sound, only gesture, only breath. But even in that silence something stirred. Because if Homo erectus mourned, even briefly, if Homo antecessor remembered the faces of the ones they ate, then we are not their end, we are their continuation. And in tracing them, in kneeling beside their scattered bones, we do not merely reconstruct their lives, we invite them back into our understanding. And the question becomes not when we became human, but whether we ever truly stopped becoming. Because to look at these early hominins is to look at the dawn of something unfinished, a spark that had not yet found the fuel it needed to bloom into consciousness as we know it. Their minds were not empty, only unlayered. Their thoughts were not absent, only unspoken. Somewhere inside the skull of Homo erectus, electrical storms of perception rippled across neural landscapes that had never been illuminated by words, yet still carried meaning. They recognized danger, they recognized kin, they recognized patterns in the landscape, cycles in the migration of prey, the rhythms of drought and rain. But without language, what form did their memories take? Were they pictures, sensations, a collage of impressions stitched together by instinct alone? How do you remember something when you have no words to hold it? Their brains, though smaller than ours, bore the hallmarks of complexity. Expanded frontal lobes, increased volume in the parietal regions. These were not brute animals, they were explorers, inventors, survivors, and yet, for all their abilities, they inhabited a world where cognition was bound tightly to the present moment. No myths to guide them, no elders to offer warnings shaped into sentences, no past or future, only the continual now of existence. Survival shaped thought. The landscape shaped behaviour, nature shaped identity. But identity itself was fluid, undefined, unspoken, and this is where the question of empathy becomes fragile. Could they sense suffering in one another? Almost certainly. Many primates do. They respond to distress calls, linger over injured companions, hesitate at certain boundaries. But empathy without language is a raw animal thing. Not the deep moral architecture we know today, but a flicker of recognition, a pause before an action, a moment of mirrored emotion that disappears as quickly as it forms. If one of their own collapsed from hunger or disease, what did they feel? Fear, loss, opportunity? Or some blend of all three, shifting moment to moment like wind across dry grass? What is compassion before compassion has a name? Their social groups were likely small, bands of perhaps a dozen or two. Each member knew the others through smell, sound, pattern. Bonds formed through proximity, grooming, shared food, and protection from predators. But these were bonds without story. They were not woven from the rituals that later humans would use to define kinship. They were not reinforced by shared values or moral codes. They were survival alliances, and alliances shift when hunger sharpens. To live in such a group was to be seen but not understood, to be cared for perhaps, but not mourned in any way we would recognize. Death was a disruption of smell, of movement, of warmth, not a philosophical rupture. And this absence of abstraction, this absence of narrative, created a world where actions were not judged. They simply were. So when one body fell, when one pair of lungs ceased its trembling rhythm, the decision that followed was not a crime, not a betrayal, not even a dilemma. It was adaptation. It was continuity. And that is where the meaning of human begins to blur, becoming something both familiar and alien, something that forces us to ask what humanity truly depends on when stripped to its earliest form. If it isn't language or love or burial or belief, what remains? Let us imagine, just for a moment, a morning over 1 million years ago. The air is thin and dry. The sun rises not over cities or cultivated fields, but over endless steppe, scattered brush, the whisper of stone scraping stone. A group of Homo erectus wakes to the sound of nothing but wind and breath. No names are exchanged, no plans are made, only gestures, only movement. And yet, there is a system here. There is routine. An individual fetches water from a nearby depression. Another scans the horizon, alert to the possibility of threat. A third tends to a child. Perhaps their own, perhaps not. There is order, but it is not civilization. There is care, but it is not compassion as we know it. And somewhere in that rhythm a thought flickers, primitive, wordless, but real. Perhaps it is anticipation. Perhaps it is fear. Perhaps it is something like memory. Because even without words, early hominins carried something forward. They remembered where the herds moved. They remembered which route soothed pain. They remembered the sound of danger in tall grass. What kind of memory is this formed in a mind without metaphor? Can you remember pain if you cannot describe it? These are not idle questions. They reach into the heart of what separates us from the ones who came before and from the ones we once were. Because memory without language is like a dream without narration. It flickers, it repeats. It does not expand, not in the way ours does, building into myth and identity. Homo erectus remembered enough to survive. But did they remember enough to change? Perhaps that is what defines humanity, not just the capacity to adapt, but the capacity to reflect on that adaptation. To ask, not just what now, but why. But that question, the why, was still sleeping. In the minds of early hominins there were no gods to explain thunder, no spirits to sanctify death, no ancestors to revere. There were only bodies, only needs, only the shifting, endless terrain of existence. And yet, that terrain was beginning to imprint itself on the brain. The repeated experiences of group life, of shared labour, of competition and alliance, they began to shape neural networks in new ways. Selection was sculpting not just the body, but the inner world. Can a species evolve toward understanding before it knows it's doing so? That is the riddle of pre-human mind, the in-between space where behaviour anticipates thought, where choices emerge not from contemplation but from subtle pressures, where the boundary between animal and human is not a line but a mist, and through that mist we begin to glimpse the fragile architecture of what would one day become soul. Not a soul as theology defines it, not the immortal whisper granted by a god, but something more grounded, more tragic, more beautiful. The soul, in this earliest form, was simply the slow dawning of self, the recognition, however fleeting, that the world contains others who move like you, hurt like you, vanish like you. In the hands of Homo erectus and Homo antecessor, the tools of survival began to shape something far greater than shelter or meat. They began to shape the inner scaffolding of mind. But before that scaffolding could hold language, before it could support story, it had to carry silence. And silence for early humans was not emptiness, it was a medium. Within it, gestures gained meaning. A stare became a warning. A pause became a decision. These were minds in motion, driven not by words but by rhythm. The rhythm of footfall on dust, the rhythm of chewing, of watching, of waiting. In those rhythms, early hominins found a kind of proto-communication, a way of passing intent without explanation. Their societies were pre-verbal, but not mindless. Their choices were not random. There was something beneath those choices, shaping behaviour over thousands upon thousands of generations. And still, the question lingers. What is morality before morality? When Homo antecessor butchered their own kind at Grandolina, was it merely hunger? Was it dominance? Was it grief distorted into practicality? We will never know the emotion behind the act, but we know this. It was repeated. The bones of at least 6 individuals, including children, bore the same marks, the same method, the same purpose. These were not isolated events. They were patterns, and patterns are the bedrock of culture. Even in a world without words, repetition becomes teaching, action becomes precedent, and precedent becomes expectation. If a group watches others strip flesh from the dead, it may learn to do the same. Not from cruelty, but from instruction. And once a behaviour becomes expected, it becomes something very close to norm. How early then did our species begin to teach one another what was acceptable? If culture is a system of transmitted behaviours, then these ancient groups were already dancing along its edge, not with chants or rituals, not with masks or music, but with fire, with stone, with meat, and perhaps with glances that lasted a moment longer than necessary. Glances that held something primitive and sacred. Recognition. The recognition that the other was not merely a thing, but somehow something more. They would not have had a word for this. They would not have needed one. It was enough to feel it briefly before the hunger returned, and yet that moment, that hesitation, that flicker of understanding, may be the first true spark of what we call humanity. Not the tool, not the fire, but the pause, the breath before the act, the place where empathy was trying to be born, and like all births it was messy, incomplete, painful. Because this was not the emergence of a perfect mind, but the slow accumulation of capacities, layer upon fragile layer. The capacity to remember, the capacity to hesitate, the capacity to see oneself, however dimly, in the body of another. None of it happened all at once. There was no single dawn, only a long, pale twilight through which the first outlines of personhood began to take shape. But even as those outlines formed, they remained unstable. The mind of Homo erectus was likely ruled by the immediate danger, food, shelter, movement. Yet within those parameters, complexity grew. They organised, they cooperated, they likely shared tasks, tracked seasons, and passed down the basics of toolmaking, not through words but through demonstration. A chipped stone handed from one generation to the next became a kind of sentence. Not spoken, but understood. And from understanding came continuity. But continuity is not consciousness. Not yet. Because true consciousness, the kind that reflects, that questions, that mourns, requires something more than pattern. It requires awareness of time, of death, of self. And in the archaeological record, these things leave shadows, not proofs. There are no funerary sites for Homo antecessor, no shrines, no pigments, no symbols, only bones broken and scorched, only tools sharp and silent. So we ask again, what is a human before the word human existed? Is it the walk, the fire, the hands, or is it something harder to trace, some whisper in the brain, still forming, still soft, that someday would become morality? And if morality is not yet born, does that mean these ancestors were without value, without worth? Or is worth itself something we project backward, hoping to find ourselves in the dust? Perhaps the more honest answer is this. Homo erectus and Homo antecessor were not failed humans. They were not half-finished versions of us. They were exactly what the world had made them. Creatures adapted to hardship, sculpted by scarcity, brilliant in ways we can barely comprehend. Their silence was not absence, but another kind of presence, a presence we still carry, because our bones are theirs, our hunger is theirs, our fire is theirs. The rhythm of our thinking, the flicker of recognition, the pull of memory, the ache of separation, these are not inventions, they are inheritances. In every act of compassion, in every hesitation before harm, we echo that ancient moment when someone, somewhere, felt a flicker of something, and didn't yet know what to call it. Before the word human, there were already beings trying to live as if it mattered, and perhaps that is the beginning of everything. Not a triumph, not a transformation, but a question shaped like a glance, like a breath, like a hand held still over another's chest, waiting to see if it will rise again. Not a tool, not a word, but a place shaped by fire and flood, by tectonic violence and ancient rains, by winds that howled across highlands and silence that pooled in the valleys like breath held too long. Eastern Africa during the Lower Pleistocene was not a backdrop to the human story. It was the sculptor's hand, a landscape so merciless and majestic that it did not merely host early hominins, it carved them, mind and bone, into what they would become. This was not the Africa of modern postcards, with flat savannas and lions beneath acacia trees. It was older, wilder, a convulsing mosaic of volcanic ridges, freshwater lakes, sun-cracked plains, and forested oases that came and went like whispers. The Rift Valley, stretching like a wound through the continent, was not only a geological fault line, it was a crucible, a place where climate shifted with terrifying speed, where ecosystems blinked out and returned, where survival was never promised and always earned. How do you build a species in a world that never stays the same? The answer, in part, is pressure. Geological records show that Eastern Africa during this time experienced immense fluctuations in temperature and moisture. Periods of relative abundance, green corridors teeming with antelope, hippos, and fruit-bearing trees would give way to drought, desolation, famine. Lake Turkana would swell and shrink like a lung, leaving behind silty shores one season and parched flats the next. These were not gentle transitions, they were abrupt, often violent, and each one acted as a sieve, filtering out the unadaptable. Those who survived were not the strongest, they were the most flexible. Flexibility in this landscape meant everything. It meant walking farther, it meant eating differently, it meant sharing or stealing or killing, it meant inventing, not with words but with stones, with movement, with choice. And this constant grinding instability didn't just shape the body, it shaped the brain. It rewarded memory, it demanded foresight, it punished hesitation. Could it be that intelligence itself emerged not from comfort, but from catastrophe? The fossil record supports this brutal rhythm. Buried in layers of sediment are bones of animals and early humans alike, caught in the in-between moments of ecological transition. Isotopic analysis reveals shifting diets, from lush plant consumption to heavy meat reliance, where patterns on teeth show alternations between chewing leaves and cracking bone. And among the tools, hand axes, cleavers, flint flakes, archaeologists find evidence of urgency, of adaptation, implements sharpened for new prey, new challenges, new wounds. The land did not forgive weakness, but it rewarded ingenuity. And somewhere between the volcanic ash and lake-borne mud, a new kind of mind began to stir, a mind forged in drought and disaster, a mind that did not expect tomorrow to resemble today, a mind that learned, painfully, that safety was a myth and permanence a lie. What kind of creature emerges when the world itself refuses to stay still? One that must learn to move, one that must learn to hunt, one that must learn to kill. Because in the Pleistocene's shifting theatre, the story of early humans was not written in firelight and myth, but in the chase, in the thrum of footfall on cracked ground, in the stillness before a strike. Eastern Africa was not empty. It was alive with predators, some familiar, others now gone into dust. Massive saber-toothed cats with jaws like traps, packs of hyenas whose jaws could shatter bone, crocodiles that ruled both river and lakeshore, and high above vultures and eagles circled, waiting not for battle but for aftermath. To walk this land was to be watched, and to be watched was to be measured. Early hominins were not apex predators, not yet. They were vulnerable, slow, relatively hairless, and burdened with infants who could not cling or run. They lacked claws, lacked speed, lacked shelter. But they had hands, they had eyes that looked far, and above all, they had cooperation. So how do you survive when nearly everything around you is better built to kill? You change the rules, you form groups, you watch the animals watching you, you memorize their patterns, you scavenge what they leave behind, the marrow-rich bones left by lions too full to finish. You carry stones, not to build, but to break. You sharpen sticks, not to sew, but to stab. And slowly, painfully, you become not prey, but something else. Not predator exactly, but a kind of opportunistic tactician. A thief of calories, a negotiator with death. In the long contest between predator and prey, calories are the currency of life. Every decision, every migration, every fight, every act of cannibalism was weighed against that desperate economy. A single kill could feed a band for a day. A missed opportunity could spell starvation, and so intelligence became a weapon. Anticipation became survival. A good memory was as useful as a sharp edge. And still, the competition remained relentless. You did not compete only with lions and leopards. You competed with others like you, other bands, other groups, other eyes watching the same herd from a different ridge, other hands reaching for the same carcass, the same shelter, the same water. This too shaped behavior. because while the predator strikes from outside, the rival waits just behind your shoulder. What happens to the mind when every meal is contested? In such a world, trust becomes both precious and perilous. Bonds tighten under stress. Outsiders become threats. Territory, though unseen by map or marker, becomes sacred. The group is everything, not because of loyalty, but because of necessity. You share with those you rely on. You defend against those you don't. And within this narrow, ruthless framework, the psychology of scarcity begins to take root. Not just the experience of hunger, but the expectation of it. A kind of ancestral paranoia, passed down not through language, but through vigilance. What does it do to a species? To grow in a world where every shadow might be the last thing you see. It teaches you to flinch before you look, to listen longer than you speak, to move only when necessary and never without intent. It rewires perception, tightens the nervous system into something vigilant, something lean, something perpetually braced for loss. And in this slow erosion of safety, a new kind of consciousness emerges. Not reflective, not moral, but reactive. A mind built not for wonder, but for wariness. Because survival in the lower Pleistocene was not just about strength, it was about pattern recognition, about drawing connections between sound and outcome, between colour and danger, between silence and the thing that comes just before the pounce. The grass lies too still, the birds lift too quickly, the air changes, and even if no language existed to name these signs, the body learned to heed them. Fear became a tool, and in the long shadow of that fear, the landscape itself began to shape how early humans organised themselves, not just physically, but emotionally. A sudden drought could wipe out a foraging route. A new predator in the area could splinter a group. A failed hunt could fray the fabric of trust. In such a world, bonding was never sentimental. It was strategic. Closeness became utility. Empathy, in its earliest form, may not have been kindness. It may have been caution. Reading the moods of others was not about connection. It was about prediction. Who might turn violent when food runs out? This is the terrain in which the psychology of scarcity was born. Not merely the experience of going without, but the certainty that abundance is always temporary. In a climate where lakes vanished and returned without warning, where prey animals migrated without pattern, where the familiar became hostile in a single season, there could be no permanence, no entitlement, no security. Even today, buried deep in our species, that fear remains, a suspicion of calm, a distrust of plenty, a readiness to lose. How does a mind protect itself from a world it cannot control? The answer, perhaps, is abstraction. The slow, halting development of symbols and associations, a rock that looks like a face, a tree that always bears fruit, a footprint too large to be familiar. These are not facts, they are fragments of meaning, and from such fragments, early minds began to build patterns not just for action, but for anticipation. Not just memory, but meaning. But meaning too is dangerous when the world is unstable, because when nothing lasts, even stories can betray you. Still, in the chaos of the Rift Valley, some things endured. The rising and falling of the sun, the circling of vultures, the red glow of coals as dusk collapsed into night, and these fragile constants became anchors, not truths, not yet, but rhythms. And in those rhythms the early mind found something like comfort, something like order, something to trust, however briefly. And perhaps it was in those small repetitions that the first feeling of time began to take shape. Not time as we know it, measured in hours, etched in calendars, but time as rhythm, as return, as loss. The migration of animals, the drying of a riverbed, the sudden green after rain. These cycles did not yet have names, but they had consequences, and consequence is a kind of memory. It teaches not only what happened, but what to expect. And so the landscape became a teacher, not gentle, not kind, but exacting. Every lesson was carved in hunger. The Rift Valley, with its deep escarpments and wide, blistered plains, was both prison and passage. It constrained movement, but also focused it. Within these corridors, early humans were forced to confront themselves as much as their environment. When rain failed, they could not simply wander forever. They had to choose which route. which lake, which risk. And these decisions were not made alone. Even in the earliest bands of Homo erectus, the group was a mind, a shifting, breathing web of needs and reactions. When one sensed threat, all responded. When one learned a new path to water, the group followed. This wasn't culture as we define it, not yet, but it was cooperation. And cooperation is a seed. But seeds only grow if they are not crushed, and many were. The fossils don't lie. They tell of children who died before age 3. Of adults with shattered limbs, never healed. Of skulls pierced or crushed not by time but by trauma. They tell of lives cut short by predators, by accidents, perhaps even by each other. And in these silences, in these absences, we are reminded that this landscape was not merely indifferent, it was antagonistic. It tested every body, every behaviour, every bond. What kind of mind survives in a world that constantly threatens to unmake it? A mind that learns to anticipate loss, to mourn quietly, to carry forward without illusion. In such a world, hope is not a light. It is a tether, a line drawn between one moment and the next, so that the self does not fall apart. And yet, even amid this brutality, there were sparks of persistence. There were footprints preserved in volcanic ash, multiple individuals walking together side by side. There were shared shelters, fire pits, clusters of discarded tools, traces not just of survival, but of togetherness. Did they feel safety when gathered in the dark? Perhaps not safety as we mean it, but something like reprieve, a brief suspension of vigilance, a moment when backs could turn without consequence. And in that moment, in that fragile trust, we see something older than civilization and deeper than culture. We see the early shape of belonging, because even in a world that gave nothing freely, that punished error with extinction, the instinct to remain together endured. It was not moral, it was strategic. But from strategy, something else was already starting to grow, something softer, something we might one day call care. And care, however faint, was radical in a world that asked for nothing but endurance, to pause for another. To wait for a child, to share meat with someone who could not hunt. These were not guaranteed behaviours, they came at a cost. But within that cost was the beginning of an idea, that survival was not just individual, that the success of the group could become a survival strategy of its own. The landscape demanded this realization, not out of generosity but out of necessity. In isolation, death came faster. A lone hominin in the rift had too many enemies, too few eyes, too little warning. But in even the most basic group, vulnerability was distributed. One could sleep while another watched. One could wound while another healed. The risk was communal, and so was the reward. And in this dynamic, a strange kind of resilience began to emerge. A species whose strength was not in muscle or claw, but in connection. Connection not just as presence, but as memory. Because even if no words yet named the bonds, the actions did. Returning to the same path, bringing food to the same shelter, tending to the injured not because of sentiment, but because they had value. These repetitions, rituals in all but name, became the scaffolding for something more enduring, not yet culture, not yet myth, but the shadows of both. The Pleistocene did not give birth to humanity. It tested the idea of it, and this test, played out across millennia, shaped everything to come. Not just our bodies, which grew leaner and more suited to endurance, not just our brains, which expanded in silent bursts over generations, but our instincts, our fears, our comforts, our need for others, the way we flinch at sudden noise, the way we form circles when danger comes, the way we seek firelight even now in the glow of screens and the warmth of another's voice. All of it echoes a world long gone but never forgotten, a world that taught us to survive, not by domination, but by adaptation, not by solitude, but by interdependence. It whispered, harshly, urgently, that change was the only constant, and that those who refused to change would vanish. And so we listened, with our bodies, with our behaviours, with our silences. The Rift Valley is quiet now, but beneath its cracked earth and layered stone the story remains. A story not of triumph, but of tension, of narrow escapes and slow awakenings, of a creature that did not yet know it was human, but who was learning, one hard season at a time, what it meant to live with others, to risk for others, to remember others. That creature would one day be us. But not yet. For now it watched the sky for vultures. It walked the same worn path to the drying lake. It napped stone by firelight. And in that firelight, for the first time, it saw not just the world, but itself, flickering, unfinished, and still becoming. There are silences that echo louder than screams, and few are more terrible than the silence of a starving body. The organs slow, the eyes glass over. The mind begins to drift, not into dream, but into a fog where reason becomes distorted and need becomes holy. And in that final, aching quiet, the creature that once sought meaning will take anything it can get, even flesh, even its own kind. What happens to the mind when hunger becomes more than a passing discomfort? When it stretches across weeks, seasons, generations? This is not a story of cruelty. It is not even a story of violence. It is a story of biology under siege. And to understand what desperation truly means, we must first understand what the body does when food disappears. In the animal kingdom, starvation is not rare, it is expected, it is ritual. Wolves eat their young, birds abandon the weakest fledglings, lizards consume their own tails. These are not acts of malice, they are strategies, a terrible kind of wisdom etched into survival. In ecosystems balanced on a knife's edge, mercy is an indulgence few can afford. Even modern humans, surrounded by plenty, are not free from these primal instructions. During famines, during shipwrecks, in frozen mountain passes, the decisions our ancestors made echo forward. There are documented cases in nearly every century of people consuming the dead to survive. And though laws change, though cultures shift, the instinct remains, a final, grim tool locked deep inside the psyche. But imagine that you were born in a world where such decisions were not rare tragedies, but seasonal probabilities. Imagine a climate where droughts erased entire generations, where prey animals vanished for years at a time, where the line between feast and famine was not months, but a single failed hunt. This was the reality of early hominins, creatures whose tools were crude and whose minds were only beginning to hold the idea of a future. For them, starvation was not an anomaly. It was the air they breathed, the way the year turned, the reason to move, the reason to fight, the reason to grieve, and it leaves traces. In the fossil record we can find the whispers of hunger, long bones with stunted growth. Tooth enamel disrupted by nutritional stress, skeletons with signs of arrested development. These are not dramatic injuries, they are quiet ones, evidence not of death, but of a life lived under constant pressure. A body that never had enough, a childhood cut short not by violence, but by absence. But some signs are louder. Some bones are broken in patterns that match marrow extraction. Some skulls bear the cut marks of deliberate defleshing, and in rare, chilling instances those marks appear not on the bones of prey animals, but on the bones of hominins themselves. What must it take to cross that line? Not greed, not madness, but hunger beyond imagination. And that hunger did not arrive as a single overwhelming moment. It crept, it eroded, it hollowed. It began with smaller choices, the scraping of bark, the chewing of roots once considered inedible, the gnawing of bones long after the marrow was gone. Over days and weeks the body learned to conserve itself. Muscles thinned, vision sharpened, the heartbeat slowed, and the mind, once capable of scanning horizons for opportunity, narrowed its focus to a single, pulsing truth. Survive. Starvation transforms behaviour long before it transforms the flesh. We see this even in modern clinical observations. People on the edge of collapse become irritable, obsessive, suspicious. They hoard crumbs. They whisper to themselves. They bargain with invisible futures. Only one more day, only one more chance. Their dreams fill with food. Their relationships fracture under the weight of need. The mind becomes both prisoner and tormentor, looping around the same idea until all other thoughts wither. Now imagine a mind far less cushioned by memory, culture, or language. a mind shaped not by stories but by instinct, a mind evolving in a world where safety is a myth, where scarcity is the rule, where the next meal is not just uncertain, it is improbable. For early hominins like Homo erectus or Homo antecessor, starvation was not a worst-case scenario. It was the baseline condition of existence, and bone does not lie. Signs of this relentless deprivation appear in the most intimate details of their remains. Lines etched in teeth, enamel hyperplasia, tell us of children who endured repeated nutritional crises before they even reached adolescence. Growth stunting reveals bodies that devoured themselves to stay alive. In some fossil assemblages, individuals show such extreme signs of long-term deprivation that survival itself becomes a miracle. And yet in this bleak biological record there is a darker chapter. Some bones show spiral fractures, breaks that occur only when fresh bone is twisted, not when dry bone snaps. Others show microscopic striations that match the slicing of stone tools, and in the most haunting examples, cut marks appear on joint surfaces and cranial vaults, places deliberately targeted for nutrient-dense tissues, brains, organs, marrow. These were not the marks of scavengers. They were the marks of hands that belonged to the same species as the one whose bones they carved. But before we recoil in modern horror, we must understand the extraordinary context. These were not acts driven by malice or ritualistic cruelty. They were acts of creatures pushed far beyond their physiological limits, creatures for whom the difference between survival and extinction might hinge on a single, desperate meal. Starvation changes not only what you will do, but what you can imagine doing. It collapses morality before morality even exists. It dissolves taboo before taboo is born. It reduces the world to binary, live or die. And in that crucible, choices emerge that only hunger can explain. But these choices are not hypothetical. They are carved quite literally into the fossil record. In northern Spain, at the site of Grandolina, archaeologists uncovered a collection of bones dated to around 800,000 years ago. Bones belonging to at least 6 individuals, all children or adolescents, all bearing the unmistakable marks of butchery. Cuts on the humerus, the femur, the ribs, spiral fractures, indicative of marrow extraction. Patterns indistinguishable from how animals were processed for food. The perpetrators? Other hominins, likely Homo antecessor. This discovery was not sensationalized in the scientific community. It was studied with restraint, verified with methodical care, and its implications were staggering. The first clear evidence of prehistoric cannibalism, not ritual, not warfare, not madness, just hunger, just necessity, just the body doing what it must to extend its grasp on life a little longer. But perhaps even more haunting than the act itself is the context. These children were not killed and eaten during a time of plenty. They were processed during stress, nutritional, seasonal, environmental. Whether they were slain for food or scavenged post-mortem is still debated. But the outcome is the same. Flesh became resource, bone became sustenance, and that changes everything. Because in this moment, we begin to see how the boundaries of behaviour are elastic under pressure. That what we call unthinkable is simply what hasn't yet needed to be thought. The body, when deprived, unlocks capacities the conscious mind cannot predict. And in this unlocking, we glimpse the rawest truth of evolution, that adaptation is not elegant. It is brutal. It is amoral. It does not move forward with vision, but with desperation. But the fossils do not speak only of cannibalism. They whisper of patterns, of recurring stresses that bent early humans toward these extremes over and over again. In layers of sediment across eastern Africa and southern Europe, we find the same signs. Teeth with developmental lines, skulls with growth interruptions, long bones with signs of repeated trauma and healing. These bodies endured not a single famine, but a world that offered hunger as a season. And where there is famine, there is fear. Not just in the body, but in the group. In starvation, trust begins to corrode. Every extra mouth is a threat. Every movement is a calculation. Do you share the last piece of dried meat? Or do you hide it? Do you let the injured fall behind? Or do you carry them, knowing the energy may cost you your own life? The social fabric begins to tear, and in the tearing choices emerge, dark ones that leave scars not just in bone, but in memory. And though these memories are lost to time, the evidence remains, quiet, patient, waiting in the earth, not asking for judgment, only understanding, because to understand is not to excuse. It is to see clearly what hunger does, not only to individuals, but to communities, to species, to the long trajectory of becoming human. It shows us the razor's edge on which our ancestors lived, how close extinction always loomed, how narrow the corridor was through which we passed, and it is in these darkest corridors that the most difficult truths reside. One of those truths is this: the very desperation that drove early hominins to consume the dead may also have played a role in sharpening the social mind. Paradoxical as it may seem, moments of extreme deprivation may have seeded the first stirrings of moral awareness, not in abstract ethics, but in risk management. In making decisions about who to feed, who to abandon, who to mourn, who to consume, these early humans began, however dimly, to perceive the cost of their actions. Not just the cost in calories, but the cost in trust. Because while a starving creature might eat a fallen companion, the group remembers. In the deep shadows of early campsites where the faint glow of fire pushed back the dark, choices were made and observed. If one individual began to prey on the weak, would they still be trusted? Would they be allowed to remain in the shelter, to sleep near others, to share food once times improved? Such questions were not yet wrapped in language or rule, but behaviour has its own grammar, older than speech, a glance, a hiss, a shared retreat. These signals could isolate the dangerous, protect the cooperative, and over time they formed the earliest roots of social cohesion, not in love, but in pragmatism, in the simple logic that those who threaten the group's survival must be dealt with. Starvation, then, was not only a destroyer, it was a shaper. It carved behaviours into the nervous system. It etched fear and caution into the brainstem. It sculpted a creature who would remember not only where the food was, but who shared it. And that memory, once it took hold, began to weave something new, a primitive accounting system of favours, risks, debts. This may be the first faint light of moral intuition, not because our ancestors had a concept of right and wrong, but because they understood in their bones that the group had limits, that certain acts, if repeated, could poison the fragile bonds that held them together, and so hunger, while brutal, may also have been a teacher of what not to do, of what might never be forgiven. And in this we find the first ghost of taboo, the ancestral line that would one day become law, then religion, then myth. Long before the 10 Commandments, long before tribal elders or sacred rituals, there was the unspoken knowledge that some acts crossed a line too dangerous to repeat. But sometimes the world did not care. Sometimes it forced the hand. Because no lesson, no unspoken taboo, no flickering glimmer of social awareness could stand against the long, relentless weight of starvation. When the rains failed, when the herds did not return, when the roots shriveled and the fires guttered in the wind, all knowledge bent under the pressure of survival. And in that bending, we glimpse the terrible paradox of early humanity, that the very instincts which would one day elevate us, empathy, foresight, restraint, were forged in conditions that often required their suppression. Fossils do not record thoughts, but they record actions, and those actions tell a story. In sites like Kandjara South in Kenya, dating back nearly 2 million years, we find signs of repeated butchery, bones with marks not only of cutting, but of strategic dismemberment, carried out with knowledge of anatomy and intention. Some of these bones belong to gazelles, others to hominins, and while many researchers debate the boundaries between scavenging and hunting, between accident and purpose, one pattern persists. Marrow was valued, brains were valued, and in some cases the only available source for those nutrients was another member of the same species. Was this murder, or salvage? Was the body already dead when the act began? We do not know, but perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps the more pressing question is this: what kind of world made such decisions possible, necessary? A world without safety nets, a world where the young and old were liabilities, a world where every step was weighed against hunger. And from that world we emerged, not untouched, not unscarred, but with a memory in our bones. Even now we carry it, in our fear of famine, in our obsession with food, in the quiet panic that arises when the pantry feels too empty or the winter too long. We see it in our myths, in stories of famished travellers, of forbidden meals, of sacred laws against eating one's own. We see it in our religions, where fasting becomes both punishment and purification, a ritual echo of ancestral suffering. The hunger never fully left us, and in a strange, sobering way, that hunger helped shape who we are. It taught us not only where to draw lines, but why those lines mattered. It forced us to reckon with our limits, to see with brutal clarity what we might become when all else is stripped away. This is not a comforting truth, but it is a necessary one, because to understand the story of humanity is to understand the edge of behaviour, the edge of survival, the edge of what a mind will do when it is very nearly undone. And on that edge, in silence and desperation, our ancestors made choices that echo still, not to horrify, not to glorify, but to remind us that before there was morality, there was need, and before there was us, there was hunger. The edge of a stone can change the course of a species, not through grandeur or brilliance, but through utility, through the quiet revolution of cutting, of scraping, of prying open the secrets locked inside bone. Long before words carved thought into permanence, another kind of carving reshaped the destiny of the early humans. A shard of volcanic glass, a flake of chert, a hand axe worn smooth with use. These were the first extensions of the hominin will, and their target was flesh. Before the mind, there were hands, and in those hands, tools. The Oldowan toolkit, humble and rudimentary, appears in the archaeological record around 2.6 million years ago. It does not gleam with sophistication. It does not whisper the elegance of design. But it works. Simple flakes struck from cobbles, their edges sharp and crude, yet capable of separating skin from muscle, sinew from bone. These were not weapons of war. They were implements of survival, and survival at that time depended on more than speed or strength. It required access to the hidden nourishment buried inside carcasses. Muscle was valued, organs more so. But the ultimate prize was marrow, the rich fatty lifeblood of bones, sealed inside by evolution's lock. Stone tools became the key, and with them the rules of death began to shift. But what happens when the carcass is not a gazelle, not a zebra, not a hyena? What happens when the bones being split bear the unmistakable curvature of a hominin femur? At first, the archaeologists at Kubifora and other Rift Valley sites noticed it only in passing. Among the heaps of fossilized detritus, broken animal skulls, tusks, limb bones, there were occasional fragments that looked eerily familiar. A humerus with its end sheared clean, a tibia with spiral fractures consistent with fresh breakage. Marks on the bone, parallel and clustered, left by a sharp edge used not to kill but to process. It was the pattern that mattered, the repetition, the precision. These were not the random chewings of scavengers. These were not the haphazard fractures of trampling or geological pressure. These were deliberate anatomical cuts, slices made along muscle attachment points, grooves where tendons once held flesh in place. And here, the unthinkable took shape. These early stone tools, created to exploit the bodies of other animals, were being used on members of the same species. The implications are staggering not because they are brutal, but because they are systematic. The processing of hominin remains followed the same steps as the processing of antelope or buffalo: defleshing, disarticulation, marrow extraction. This was not a moment of chaos, it was a ritual of hunger. What must it have felt like, to be the one holding the stone, the one doing the cutting? Could the mind that shaped the tool grasp the weight of what it was doing? Or was this simply another act in the eternal theatre of survival, where identity dissolves in the face of need, and even kin becomes meat? To answer that, we must look more closely at the tools themselves, because in their shapes and scars we find a record of behaviour more honest than memory. The Oldowan flakes that first opened carcasses were only the beginning. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these rough implements evolved into something far more refined, the Acheulean hand axe. Appearing around 1.7 million years ago, the Acheulean toolkit marks a profound shift in cognition. These teardrop-shaped tools were not accidental. They required planning, symmetry, intention. They fit comfortably in the hand, their edges expertly sharpened for cutting through hide, slicing muscle, and, when needed, splitting bones with efficiency unknown before. While still simple by later standards, their design shows a leap in understanding, a mind that could envision a shape before it existed, and then bring that shape into being. And the bodies left behind, animal and hominin alike, show the consequences of that new ability. Cut marks on fossilized bones reveal a choreography of butchery, a sequence repeated across continents and centuries. First, the removal of skin. Long, shallow incisions parallel to one another where the blade skimmed the surface. Then deeper cuts along tendons, severing limbs at predictable anatomical points. Marrow accessed last. Through heavy blows that cracked long bones in spirals, a pattern visible even millions of years later. What is astonishing is how consistently this pattern appears. A zebra butchered at Olduvai Gorge shows the same sequence as a hominin child at Grandolina. A gazelle in Kenya bears the same tool scars as a human radius in Ethiopia. This is not coincidence. It is knowledge, passed down not through language, but through imitation, through necessity, through the slow, quiet refinement of technique. And so, when we find cut marks on early human bones, we know they were not created in ignorance. They were made by creatures who understood where muscle attached, where joints could be pulled apart, where fat and marrow hid. They approached their dead, or their fallen, with the same practiced motions used on other prey. The implication is not that early humans were cruel, but that they were efficient, that the boundary between animal and kin was not yet fixed, not yet protected by taboo or memory. This is where stone tools become more than objects. They become evidence of world view. Because a tool is not just a shard of stone, it is a lens into the mind holding it. A hand that grips a hand axe to butcher another mammal understands death as opportunity, not mystery. A hand that grips that same axe over a hominin corpse reveals something deeper. That identity had not yet stabilized, that social bonds were fragile, that hunger was louder than recognition. These tools did not create violence. They revealed it. They magnified it. They made visible a truth that the landscape had already carved into the psyche, that in times of scarcity, flesh is flesh, and the body is a resource waiting to be claimed. Yet even in this stark reality, the tools tell a story not only of desperation, but of comprehension, of beings beginning to understand their world by shaping it, one fractured stone at a time. These tools did not create violence. They revealed it. They magnified it. They made visible a truth that the landscape had already carved into the psyche, that in times of scarcity, flesh is flesh, and the body is a resource waiting to be claimed. This becomes even clearer when we examine the comparative evidence, the difference in how early humans processed animal remains versus the remains of their own kind. To the bone, the treatment is eerily similar. The same patterns of disarticulation, the same marrow-rich long bones split clean, the same slicing and scraping around joints. The stone flakes leave no room for ambiguity. They were used with purpose, not clumsily or experimentally, but in deliberate sequences that echo across time. At sites like Grandolina in Spain, dated to around 800,000 years ago, the evidence is overwhelming. Here, within the ancient sediments of a collapsed cave system, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 11 individuals, all attributed to Homo antecessor. Their bones were found intermingled with the remains of deer, horses, and other prey species. And like those animals, the human bones bear unmistakable marks of butchery. Cut marks on crania, evidence of tongue removal, and strategic marrow extraction from long bones. The processing wasn't symbolic, it was nutritional. There is no indication that these hominin bodies were treated differently, no signs of burial. No careful placement, no objects left as tribute or remembrance. Instead, the remains suggest efficiency, Bodies reduced to parts, heads fractured to reach the brain, limbs stripped of flesh, broken to harvest the core. And once their nutritional value was gone, they were discarded with the rest of the refuse, alongside antelope hooves and horse teeth, in the garbage of survival. This brutal parity between prey and person tells us something profound. It tells us that the concept of self and other had not yet expanded to include all members of the group, let alone the species. That the early understanding of social bonds was likely limited to immediate kin or small foraging units. Strangers, or even less favoured members of the group, may have occupied a category not unlike that of scavenged meat. And it was the tool that made that transition possible, because stone tools did not just make death useful, they made it manageable. They turned corpses into calories. They extended the range of survival, especially in harsh or seasonal environments where plant foods dwindled and hunting failed. With a flake of obsidian or basalt, the body could become one more resource to be redistributed, one more margin of safety against starvation. The morality of such actions is a modern concern, but the pragmatism is ancient, and in these moments we must be careful not to project backward our own discomfort. To a mind forged in scarcity, fed by immediacy, shaped by fear and need, the body, any body, was not a sacred vessel. It was matter, it was opportunity, it was what remained when life left and hunger remained. And the tools, sharp, silent, durable, were always ready to begin again. To understand just how intentional this butchery was, we must look deeper into the sequences themselves. Those step-by-step patterns archaeologists painstakingly reconstruct from the faintest scratches on fossilised surfaces. These sequences are not random, they are not chaotic. They reveal a sophistication that reaches far beyond simple hacking and tearing. They suggest choreography, memory, repetition, and almost anatomical familiarity passed through generations not by language, but by observation and necessity. The first step was often the most delicate, skinning. On both animal and hominin remains, we see the long, shallow incisions that trace the contours of limbs and torso. Stone flakes followed the natural lines of the body, sliding beneath the outer layer to free the hide. Even in the earliest examples, the cuts are placed exactly where skilled butchers place them today, starting at joints, moving along muscle boundaries, working with the body rather than against it. Then came disarticulation. This was not hacking indiscriminately at bone. It required knowing where tendons anchor, where ligaments yield, where leverage could be applied with minimal force. Early humans learned to rotate limbs, twist them, strain them until each joint revealed its weak point. A few precise slices would sever what held it together. Modern forensic experiments show that the patterns on these ancient fossils match this process perfectly. Finally came defleshing and marrow extraction. Here is where the Acheulean hand axe shines. A tool heavy enough to crack open a femur, sharp enough to peel muscle away in long strips, and durable enough to survive repeated blows against dense bone. The spiral fractures so commonly found on early hominin long bones tell us they were broken while still fresh, when the collagen inside allowed the bone to splinter in distinctive curves. Dry bones do not fracture this way. Only newly deceased bodies produce this unmistakable pattern. This was not scavenging, this was butchery. And perhaps the most revealing detail of all is the order in which these steps tended to occur. Across many sites, the skulls, human or animal, show signs of being opened last. Brain tissue is rich in fat, but also highly perishable. Once exposed, it must be eaten quickly. The careful timing suggests a familiarity with how long different tissues could remain edible, and which should be consumed first once the body was opened. There is one more unsettling layer. Some hominin remains show evidence of repeated modifications, not just initial processing, but secondary actions. Bones gnawed after cutting, marrow chambers revisited hours later, even small stone flake marks clustered on areas where muscle is minimal. In other words, individuals return to the same body more than once. This implies not panic, but planning. It implies survivors who rationed what they had, returning for calories long after the initial feast had passed. It implies a mind aware not just of present hunger, but of hunger yet to come, a future-oriented desperation carved into the daily rhythm of existence. And as the tools shaped bodies, The bodies, through their scarcity, shaped minds in return, forging a relationship between death and survival that would echo throughout the entire human lineage. This is where the archaeological story of tools becomes inseparable from the psychological story of early humanity. The Acheulean hand axe was not merely a device to process flesh. It was the first object that blurred the line between function and identity, survival and meaning. Held in the palm of an ancestor who did not yet speak, it was a symbol of dominion over nature and increasingly over one another. But there is another dimension to consider: the social echoes of butchery. These actions were not done in secret. In many cases, the processing of carcasses, be they animal or hominin, happened in the open, within encampments or shared spaces. Bones were scattered across habitation floors. Cut marks often show signs of multiple angles, as if different individuals took turns in the process. This suggests that cannibalism, where it occurred, was not a solitary act of madness. It was shared. It was witnessed. Did they feel anything, those early ancestors? Was there revulsion? Was there grief? We have no way of knowing. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The emotional world of early hominins may have been murky, limited, and fragmented, but not blank. Their faces had expressions. Their bodies held fear. They knew pain, and in some unrecorded way they must have known loss. Still, their actions show that these feelings, if they existed, did not override hunger, and that is the brutal clarity of the archaeological record. It does not lie to comfort us. It tells us that the history of humanity is not a straight ascent toward compassion. It is a spiral, with loops of desperation, adaptation, and invention. The tools we celebrate as marks of progress were also agents of dismemberment. The hands that shaped them were clever enough to plan a future, but often lived in one without guarantees. Even as we marvel at the innovation of stone tools, at the intelligence it took to design, at the muscle memory it took to replicate, there remains the inescapable truth of what they were used for. They were made to cut, and when food ran out, that meant cutting whatever flesh remained. And so, we arrive at the crossroads of cognition and need, of survival and self. The story of stone tools is not just the story of how we learned to shape the world, but how the world shaped us in return, honing our instincts, testing our ethics before ethics existed, and forcing our ancestors to make choices no creature should have to make. The evidence of butchery on human bones is not just a forensic detail. It is a testament to the impossible decisions faced in prehistory's most silent corners. In the edge of every ancient blade lies a question: what are we willing to become when everything else is gone? And the answer, left in fragments of shattered bone and flint, is this: we became toolmakers, even when those tools turned inward. There is a peculiar silence in the bones, quiet not from lack of story, but from the weight of what they remember. Long after voices have vanished, after the last breath has dissolved into wind, what remains is the record written in fleshless mineral, a history not told, but carved. And sometimes that record turns inward. Sometimes it tells of teeth against kin. The earliest known evidence of prehistoric cannibalism lies not in a single dramatic discovery, but in a growing constellation of sites scattered across the Old World. Fragments found in Kenya, Spain, Ethiopia, and beyond, all whispering the same question. Who were they, the ones who consumed their own? And what drove them to that terrible intimacy? To begin unravelling this question, we must turn to patterns, not of speech or art, for those had not yet come, but patterns etched into bone. Defleshing, marrow extraction, breakage under torsion. These are not accidents of decay, but deliberate sequences performed with chilling familiarity. When archaeologists examine ancient hominin remains and find long bones split at both ends, teeth marks on joint surfaces, and flake scars from stone tools clustered along muscle-rich areas, they recognize a script. The same script followed when butchering antelope or gazelle. The same methods applied with eerie precision to their own kind. At Grandolina in northern Spain, the bones of Homo antecessor children and adolescents lie among the debris of butchered deer. The cut marks are identical. The bone fragmentation is identical. Even the order of disarticulation, the pulling apart of limbs from torso, the cracking of crania to reach the fatty brain within, matches the sequences known from nutritional cannibalism. These were not ritual acts, not sacred farewells or symbolic gestures. These were meals. What must it have meant to learn to eat in this way? Was it a breaking point in the psyche? Or simply another act of pragmatism in a world where death and hunger dance too closely to separate? Some patterns repeat so consistently across early sites that they almost lose their power to shock. In Kenya's Kubifora region, where the earliest evidence of hominin cannibalism emerges from bones over 1.5 million years old, the same spiral fractures appear, fresh breaks to access marrow, tool marks near major muscle attachments, and gnaw marks that suggest not the casual curiosity of scavengers, but the persistent attention of survivors. The line between necessity and horror becomes hard to draw when both wear the same mask. Yet not all cases are identical. In some assemblages, adults dominate the remains. In others, it is the small, fragile bones of children that carry the story. Sometimes they are mixed, young and old, male and female, all reduced to resource. And so the question sharpens. Were the victims random? Were they enemies? Or were they kin? What kind of bond or fracture allows one to take a life that once looked back with human eyes? And what in return does such a choice take from the soul of a species? To find that answer, we must look closer at the victims, not just the wounds they carried, but the lives they might have led before becoming sustenance. The skeletal record reveals not just action, but identity. At multiple sites, the age profile of cannibalized remains tells a troubling story. Children, some no older than 6, make up a disproportionate number of the defleshed individuals. In the Grandolina site, for instance, nearly all the processed bones belong to juveniles and adolescents. They're smaller bones, they're developing teeth, they're fragile cranial plates, each one marked by flake scars, cut marks, and fractures consistent with deliberate processing. Why children? The simplest answer is logistical. Small bodies are easier to dismember, easier to transport, easier to consume quickly before decomposition sets in. From a purely biological perspective, their bones still held fat, and their muscles, though less developed, still offered nutrition. But this answer, while coldly practical, brushes against the edge of something darker. Because children are not simply smaller adults. In any social species, they represent the future, the investment of time and care, the fragile carriers of what is yet to be. To consume them is not only to survive a moment, it is to cannibalize tomorrow. Some researchers have suggested that this pattern may point to a group structure where non-kin children, perhaps captured or orphaned, were treated differently than immediate offspring. Others propose that resource scarcity reached such dire levels that even kin bonds were not enough to prevent consumption. In such a world, the calculus of survival shifts. The body closest, the body weakest, becomes the body consumed. And yet, among the fragments, not all victims were children. In several assemblages, such as those found at Moulagersi in France and Bodo in Ethiopia, adult bones also show signs of systematic processing. These were not isolated events. They appear in layers, in repetitions suggesting behaviour repeated over time, a strategy, not an accident, a response embedded in memory. The cannibal's identity is harder to determine. Stone tools do not leave fingerprints, and the bones tell us little of who wielded the blade, only what they left behind. Still, by analysing the surrounding evidence, the presence of hearths, the clustering of remains, the proximity of tool debris, archaeologists can infer that the cannibals were often part of the same group as the consumed. These were not outsiders raiding the dead. They were insiders managing the living and the dying, deciding, perhaps as a group, what to do when options ran out. In this light, cannibalism becomes not merely an act of desperation, but a social negotiation, a choice made under pressure in a context of extreme scarcity, guided by norms that no longer resemble our own. It is a mirror held to a time when the line between food and family blurred, and when survival carved that line deeper than empathy could erase. But to truly grasp the meaning of cannibalism in early prehistory, we must ask one of the most difficult questions of all. Was it only about nutrition? Or was something else at work? Something more ritual, more symbolic, perhaps even proto-cultural? Here, the trail grows faint, and the evidence becomes slippery. For while nutritional cannibalism leaves its signature in the form of cut marks and marrow fractures, symbolic cannibalism operates in a different register, one that hints at meaning, identity, and memory. In much later periods, among anatomically modern humans, we begin to see tantalizing clues: skulls that have been deliberately modified into cups, bones arranged in patterned ways, cremated remains of individuals who seem to have been both revered and consumed. But those come tens or hundreds of thousands of years after the earliest acts we now consider, and yet the line may not be as clear as we think. Even among earlier hominins, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antecessor, there are instances where the treatment of bodies diverges from pure pragmatism. At the Bodo site in Ethiopia, for example, a Homo heidelbergensis skull shows signs of defleshing, but not of marrow extraction. The brain case remains intact. There are no spiral fractures on long bones, just careful, methodical removal of tissue from the face and cranium, as if someone was working with precision, not for food, but for transformation. What are we to make of this? Some paleoanthropologists argue that it may represent a form of corpse preparation, or even an early funerary practice. Others caution against projecting modern categories backward onto beings who may have had no concept of ceremony. Still, the intent behind such careful manipulation cannot be dismissed. It suggests that even in a world where hunger ruled, there were moments when bodies were treated differently, not just as meat, but as memory. It is in this ambiguity that the cannibal puzzle becomes most profound, because cannibalism is not a monolith. It is a spectrum, and one that reflects the complex pressures and responses of evolving minds. On one end lies the sheer desperation of nutritional survival, bone as calorie, brain as fat reserve. On the other, something that gestures toward meaning, perhaps grief, perhaps respect, perhaps fear of what the dead might become if left unmarked. There are even hints that cannibalism could have served a communicative role. In some highly fragmented assemblages, certain bones, especially skulls and femurs, appear to have been curated after defleshing. They were not discarded with other remains. They may have been kept, revisited, or used in ways we do not yet understand. While we cannot claim religion or ritual without stronger evidence, what we do see is an emerging complexity, an inkling of symbolic behaviour nestled within the mechanics of survival. And it is here, in this liminal space between body and idea, that we begin to see the first stirrings of what might one day become culture. Not the culture of cave paintings or carved figurines, not yet, but something quieter, something older. A decision to treat a body not merely as refuse, not solely as fuel, but as something marked by identity. However faint, however fleeting, this shift suggests that even in a world shaped by tooth and stone, there were rules, perhaps not laws, but patterns of behaviour that tethered individuals to each other in ways that extended beyond life. Such patterns, if they existed, would have been shaped by ecological pressure as much as by cognition. In periods of prolonged scarcity, when droughts shriveled vegetation, when prey herds collapsed, when rivers dried to cracked bone, entire communities would have found themselves cornered. Survival under these conditions demanded decisions that cut deeper than any tool. Cannibalism, then, may have arisen not just from what was available, but from what was acceptable under extreme duress. In this context, it becomes not an act of chaos, but a grim strategy, a communal response encoded in necessity, a means of enduring the unendurable, where those who died may have been seen not simply as lost, but as still useful, still contributing even in death to the continuation of the group. This interpretation, while difficult to face, casts cannibalism not as a failure of empathy, but as a form of distorted altruism. Yet the archaeological record reminds us that such acts left scars, not just on bone, but on lineage. In some layers, the repeated signs of human consumption suggest patterns passed down through generations. These weren't isolated collapses, but recurring behaviours, learned responses, adapted strategies, perhaps even inherited traditions. But what happens when the body becomes a tool of survival too many times? What does it do to the minds of those who remain? It is here that symbolic cannibalism may have emerged, not from abundance, but from reckoning, a transformation of necessity into meaning, a way to explain the unexplainable, to live with the choices made in firelight and silence. Among later Homo species, including early Homo sapiens, we begin to find ritualized burials that suggest a different relationship to the dead, one of protection, of mourning, of continuity. But in the murkier world of earlier hominins, those gestures may have begun with consumption, not separation. And even within that, there may have been rules. Perhaps certain individuals were off limits. Perhaps it was only the very young, or the very old, or the already dying. Perhaps the act was veiled in some unspoken protocol, performed in certain places, at certain times. These are shadows of speculation, but they remind us that even acts we see as brutal may have carried their own order, an early form of structure in a world without language, where the only shared truths were the rhythms of life and death, and among those rhythms sometimes flesh became memory. This convergence of the physical and the symbolic, of nourishment and narrative, marks the final layer of the cannibal puzzle. Because while we can measure the angles of cut marks and map the spiral patterns of fractured bone, we cannot so easily reconstruct the meanings behind those gestures. And yet, we try. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because these acts stand at the edge of something momentous, the dawning of moral imagination. When a body becomes more than a carcass, when its treatment reflects more than need, we begin to glimpse the roots of value. This is what makes prehistoric cannibalism so haunting. It doesn't just challenge our stomachs, it challenges our sense of where humanity begins. Is it in language, in burial, in kindness? Or is it also in the recognition of tragedy, the silent understanding that survival sometimes demands the unacceptable? The bones do not answer, they only ask again and again. And so we return to the sites, to Grandolina, with its mingled remains of deer and child, to Bodo, with its carefully flensed skull, to Mula Gersi, where early Homo sapiens left behind butchered bodies indistinguishable from those of prey. Each site a still life of necessity, each fracture a frozen moment of calculation. There is no evidence of pleasure, no trophies, no boasts, only the rhythm of survival, performed in stone and silence. But it is in this very absence that the deeper story unfolds, because to live through such a world was not just to face hardship, it was to shape a brain, a body, and a future species under pressure. The stress of starvation, the burden of impossible choices, the thin line between community and competition, all of these formed the crucible in which the modern mind evolved. The cannibal was not a monster, they were our ancestor. And in them we see not only what we once were, but the forces that made us what we became. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that cannibalism was never simply an aberration. It may have been an adaptation, a behaviour that, in the harshest of contexts, allowed our lineage to continue, and in that continuation lay the seeds of something more. The very horror of the act may have birthed its own counterweight, a growing capacity for empathy, memory, and eventually taboo. It may have taught us what should not be done, precisely because it had once been necessary to do it. We carry that memory still, not in conscious thought, but in the architecture of our aversions, the stories we tell, the revulsions we feel. They are echoes of choices made long before we had words for guilt or grief. And so, beneath the dust of ancient earth, beneath the fractured bones and tooth-scored joints, lies the quiet origin of something vast. The first flicker of a conscience shaped not in peace, but in desperation. The cannibal puzzle, then, is not about horror. It is about inheritance. At some point, no one knows exactly when, a spark caught in the dry grass of an African plain and did not die. The wind did not scatter it. The rain did not drown it. Instead, the flame endured, and around that flame the night changed forever. For hundreds of thousands of years our ancestors feared the dark. They fled from the glowing eyes in the underbrush, from the howls and shadows that slid silently between trees. But fire gave them a different kind of night, a night no longer ruled by fear, but by reflection. What happens when light stops coming only from the sky and begins to emerge from human hands? The emergence of fire control, true mastery of flame, is among the most profound revolutions in the human story. At sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where traces of ash lay buried more than 1 million years deep, archaeologists found not only charcoal, but intention. The soot-stained layers do not speak of wildfire or accident. They whisper of choice, of fire deliberately maintained, nested into the lives of Homo erectus. Hearths did not appear fully formed. They began as clusters of burnt bone and scorched stone, signalling a gradual dance with flame. But once the first hearth was established, it changed the shape of everything that came after. Because fire does not merely warm or ward, it reveals. In the flickering orange halo of the hearth, objects and faces become animated in new ways. Teeth flash in laughter or hunger. Shadows stretch and shrink in rhythm with the flames. Tools glint. Eyes reflect back your own gaze. It is here that the shape of social life shifted from the fleeting movements of the hunt to the still, suspended intimacy of sitting together. Around fire, time slows. Conversations deepen. Memory takes root. Did language itself grow here, in the warmth between bodies and the silence between sparks? The heat of fire made the night tolerable, but it also made flesh transform. Cooked meat is easier to chew, easier to digest, and yields more calories than raw flesh ever could. This allowed for something crucial: smaller guts and bigger brains. The metabolic trade-off was no accident. It was a leap forward written in flame. With every meal pulled from the fire, energy once locked in fibre and tendon flowed more freely into cognition. Over time, this didn't just nourish bodies, it nourished awareness. But fire did more than reshape food, it reshaped meaning. What did it mean to sit with the dead by firelight, to watch flesh cook from bone, not in haste, but in ritual? Long before burial, long before memorial, there may have been this: a quiet moment, meat turning slowly in the glow, smoke curling skyward like a soul unspoken. In this space, death became visible, not as an ending, but as a transformation. And what happens when death is no longer hidden, but seen in the flicker of the flame? In the firelight, decay no longer meant disintegration alone. It could now mean conversion. A body, once feared or revered, became something else entirely when placed close to the hearth, first heated, then softened, then changed. Whether this transformation was practical or spiritual, deliberate or emergent, the psychological effect was profound. Fire introduced a temporal boundary between death and disappearance. It allowed the living to linger longer with the remains of the dead, to bear witness to a passage rather than a vanishing. And in bearing witness, something else took shape: reflection. The earliest hearths were not just kitchens, they were theatres. Around them, gestures gained new context. Eye contact lengthened. Shared meals took on rhythm. And through that rhythm, a proto-ritual may have emerged. Cooking itself, turning raw into ready, mirrored the transformations taking place within the social group. As fire softened sinew, it also softened distance between minds. The warmth drew bodies near, but it was the act of waiting together, watching, smelling, remembering, that began to mould collective awareness. We are not the only species to consume the dead. But we may be the only one to do so while looking into the fire. Fire transformed the act of eating into something more than sustenance. It slowed it down, forced patience, created time for story, gesture, hierarchy. It allowed food to be shared, portioned, reconsidered. With raw meat, urgency dominated. With cooked food, a different kind of power emerged, one based not just on who hunted, but on who served, who fed, who led the circle in silence or speech. And in this slow unfurling of social complexity, cooking became a strategy as well as a symbol. For early humans, cooked food meant more than calories. It meant safety. Pathogens that might linger in raw flesh were destroyed in the heat. Toxins diminished. Even the texture of meat changed, lessening the strain on jaws, freeing up cranial structure over evolutionary time. The implications were vast: smaller teeth, finer features, larger brains, and with larger brains came deeper memory. With deeper memory came stronger bonds. Fire fed the body, yes, but it also fed the mind. Consider how long it takes to roast a joint of meat thoroughly over a low flame. You cannot walk away. You cannot be entirely distracted. You must stay. Watch. Wait. This necessity created pause, and within that pause, bonds formed. Perhaps this is where gossip was born, not in the forest chase, but in the lingering moments beside the coals, and perhaps, too, it is where mourning began. The same fire that fed the group also became the place where the dead might be spoken of, remembered, perhaps even symbolically consumed. Whether the flesh being cooked belonged to antelope or ancestor, the fire made it visible. And in that visibility, memory began to harden into meaning. Not just what we eat, but who we are. Fire marked a shift in how our ancestors saw food, flesh, and perhaps even each other. The glow of firelight cast long shadows, and in those shadows new minds began to awaken. Because fire, unlike other tools or technologies, could not be held. It had to be tended. It demanded attention, care, foresight. A sharp stone could be buried and forgotten. A spear could be broken and replaced. But fire had to be fed. To keep it alive, one had to think ahead, anticipate the weather, guard against wind. In this way, fire trained the mind for planning, an ability that would become essential to the survival of early Homo species in unpredictable environments. And so, across generations, those who mastered the care of flame may have also mastered the care of others. The hearth became the emotional heart of a group, not simply a practical innovation, but a social one. Fire gave structure to time. Day became divided not just by light and dark, but by mealtimes, by warmth, by gathering. In seasonal migrations or harsh winters, the fire circle was the place to which all returned. Its constancy lent shape to otherwise chaotic lives. In its steadiness, it may have planted the first seeds of home. Cooking itself was a transformation not only of food, but of the social contract. In a world where life was short and survival never guaranteed, the ability to cook and distribute food created bonds of trust and dependence. A cooked meal, once given, could not be taken back. The act required surrender, of time, of resources, of protection. In this surrender, a kind of proto-ethic emerged. The group began to rely on more than strength. They began to rely on generosity, and this generosity reshaped power. Among other primates, dominance is often expressed in violence or threat. But around the hearth, dominance became something quieter. Who got the best portions? Who sat closest to the centre? Who spoke while others listened? These subtler forms of hierarchy, bound up in the rituals of eating and watching, may have allowed for new kinds of leadership. Those who could manage flame were respected. Those who shared food were remembered. Status became not only a matter of force, but of memory. And memory lives long in the glow of coals. There's evidence from sites like Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dating back nearly 780,000 years, that hominins were not just using fire, but organising their space around it. Charred wood, burned seeds, and stone tools were found in distinct clusters, suggesting that specific areas of a campsite were used for particular tasks. This spatial organisation implies a level of social coordination, and perhaps even an early sense of territory or identity. It tells us that fire didn't just warm bodies, it ordered minds, and when minds become ordered, culture begins to take form. The controlled use of fire may not have sparked language, but it certainly created the conditions for it to thrive. Faces lit from below, gestures emphasised in shadow, stories whispered over crackling logs. This was the theatre of our ancestors. In the firelight, ideas could be passed not just between mouths, but between generations. And with those ideas came the first flickers of continuity. Continuity, the thread that binds moments together, that allows experience to become narrative. Around the fire, the present was no longer just a reaction to the past. It became a staging ground for future thought. Fire, with its steady rhythm and patient glow, gave structure to memory. The same flames that cooked the day's hunt also softened the edges of trauma. In the warmth, there was room for reflection, for the first stirrings of a mind that could make meaning from pain. And in that meaning, something deeper began to stir. Ritual. What separates a meal from a ceremony? Perhaps it is repetition, or perhaps it is the presence of the ineffable, the invisible sense that a moment matters. Fire, with its hypnotic dance, offered a canvas upon which significance could be painted. Cooking was no longer merely an act of survival, it was a performance. The deliberate turning of meat, the arrangement of stones, the placement of wood, these acts, done over and over, gained a rhythm that would one day become sacred. From this rhythm emerged a new possibility: remembrance. Even today, the act of gathering around a fire evokes something ancient. Campfires remain places where stories are told, where silences are permitted, where the dead are remembered. In the deep past, this may have been the very beginning of commemoration. If bodies were cooked, whether animal or human, the fire gave their transformation a visible form. Bones blackened, flesh curled and smoked. The living could not look away. They were present for the passage, and presence, in this context, is a kind of reverence. Not all cooking of flesh was cannibalistic. But where it was, fire added a layer of solemnity, or horror, that raw consumption never could. The warmth of the hearth may have blurred the line between nourishment and remembrance. To eat in silence by the glow may have been an act of survival, or it may have been a gesture towards something older than grief, an instinct to witness, to mark, to acknowledge. It is possible, even likely, that not all who were consumed were killed in violence. Some remains, like those at Atapuerca in Spain, suggest repeated access to human bones in ways that hint at ritual. The bodies, fragmented, scraped, cracked for marrow, show signs of deliberate processing. But the care taken in the placement of some remains suggests that more than hunger may have been at work. Fire gave form to this ambiguity. It allowed both the destruction and the preservation of the dead to exist within the same space. The hearth was a paradox, a place of life and of loss. To gather around it was to participate in a slow ritual of transformation. Whether cooking antelope haunch or the flesh of a fallen kin, the fire rendered all bodies into memory. And in doing so, it gave our ancestors something profound, not just warmth, not just food, but a first flickering sense that life continued, even in the smoke. And smoke, as it rises, carries stories skyward. The stories may not have had words, not yet, but they had rhythm. The clack of bone on stone, the crackle of flame, the hush that fell when meat was turned over the fire, all of it formed a kind of language, a syntax of survival. And in that rhythm, meaning was shared. Perhaps not spoken, but felt, passed from glance to glance, from hand to hand, encoded in gesture, in patience, in the trust of shared silence. Fire demanded that early humans slow down. And in that slowness, self-awareness could grow. This awareness did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It drifted in, like smoke curling through tree branches, subtle, searching, soft. A being crouched by the hearth, watching fat bubble from a bone, may have begun to see not just food, but time. The process taught them that heat changes everything, that what was once hard can be made tender, that what was feared can be rendered safe, that what was dead can still feed life. And these truths, repeated over lifetimes, may have become the foundations of thought. Because cooking is, in many ways, the first chemistry. It is transformation made visible. What happens in the fire is irreversible, and so it taught our ancestors not just cause and effect, but consequence. The smell of burning taught caution. The warmth taught comfort. The blackened bone taught memory, all of it encoded without language into the growing architecture of the mind. And mind, once awakened, begins to seek patterns. The regularity of firelight made the night less frightening. Shadows, once haunted by predators, now danced to familiar rhythms. This gave space for imagination. The mind could wander farther when the body was warm and safe. And in this wandering, perhaps the first questions were born, not about the stars, not yet, but about each other. Who am I in this circle? What do I mean to the rest? And what does it mean when the person I knew is no longer here? Such thoughts are invisible in the archaeological record. But the traces of fire, blackened earth, charred bone, concentric rings of ash, hint at lives lived in proximity to one another, in continuity. And when we find human remains near hearths, processed alongside animal ones, the lines blur. Was this a meal or a mourning? Was this hunger or remembrance? Fire does not tell us. but it shows us that the question mattered, because only a creature capable of wondering would ask it. The hearth, in this light, becomes more than a tool. It becomes the first altar, not of worship necessarily, but of attention. It was the place where focus was shared, where transformation was made communal, and through that focus something ancient was born, a sense that to be together in the glow, to witness the changing of flesh, was to belong to something larger than the self. And perhaps that is the real gift fire gave us. Not just warmth, not just cooked meat, but the first feeling of we. In a circle of ash, beneath a night sky unbroken by language, a group of early humans may have passed around a piece of flesh that once held thought. The fire crackled. The wind did not judge. And in that moment, something ancient and unsettling took root. Not just hunger, but meaning. Cannibalism, to modern ears, arrives draped in revulsion. It carries with it an aura of moral violation, a crossing of boundaries we hold sacred. But for our ancestors, in the deep hours before civilization, those boundaries had not yet been drawn. There was no word for taboo, because there were no words at all. There were only choices. There was only survival. And perhaps in rare and desperate moments there was something else, something ritualistic, something binding, something whispered in the space between fear and kinship. What happens when a tribe, fractured by starvation or haunted by the memory of a fallen member, makes the decision to consume one of its own? The answer is not written in bone alone. Forensic traces of ancient cannibalism, cut marks, fracture patterns, signs of boiling, tell us what happened, but they do not reveal intention. And yet anthropology offers a bridge, a dim mirror reflecting echoes of behaviour from the more recent past. Across the scattered diversity of human cultures, cannibalism has emerged not only as an act of desperation, but as something far more nuanced, as a social signal, a rite, even an expression of reverence or rage. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, certain groups practiced endocannibalism, the ritual consumption of their own deceased. Flesh was not discarded but transformed, taken in by those who remained as a way of holding on. In some cases this was framed as an act of love, of mourning, of spiritual continuity. In others, enemies killed in warfare were consumed as a gesture of dominance, a way of turning the violence of the hunt into an act of assimilation or humiliation. And elsewhere still, such as in the Amazon among the Wari, consuming the dead was framed not as desecration, but as the only dignified way to dispose of a loved one's body. To leave it to rot in the earth was considered the true offence. These practices, though shocking to us, suggest a sobering possibility that eating human flesh, in certain cultural frames, was neither cruel nor pathological. It was structured. It was imbued with meaning. And if that is true of modern humans with complex symbolic lives, could the roots of such behaviour lie far deeper than we thought? Could early cannibalism have been about more than hunger? The idea demands caution. It demands humility. Because to project culture backwards into the lower Pleistocene is to tread on speculative ground. And yet the parallels are hard to ignore. When we find butchered human remains among hearths and stone tools, when the patterns repeat across time and space, we must ask not just how, but why. And in that question, the tribe itself flickers into view, half seen, half imagined, but undeniably human. Because a tribe is not merely a cluster of individuals, it is a web of obligations, fears, loyalties, and unspoken hierarchies. And cannibalism, where it arises in the ethnographic record, has almost always been tied to these deeper currents. Rarely is it random, rarely is it chaotic. More often it is rule-bound, woven into the structure of a community's beliefs about life, death, and belonging. Among the four people of New Guinea, funerary cannibalism was an affirmation of relationship. Women and children consumed the flesh of deceased kin, believing that to leave the body to decay was an abandonment. What seems unthinkable to us was, to them, an act of love, a way to carry a life forward, literally, inside the living. The practice had rules. Who could eat? What parts could be consumed? When the ritual could occur. It was not the collapse of morality. It was morality expressed through a different lens. Elsewhere, in societies where warfare was frequent, cannibalism appeared as a marker of power. The Carib peoples of the Lesser Antilles consumed small portions of slain enemies, not as a meal, but as a symbolic act of dominance. In these cases, flesh was transformed into a statement: you are defeated, and your strength is now ours. This was not about sustenance, it was about message. And then there were groups like the Wari, whose endocannibalistic rites were suffused with grief. During funerary feasts they did not eat enemies but loved ones. Children consumed parents, siblings consumed siblings. Tears flowed freely. To place the body in the earth unconsumed, untransformed, was seen as cruel. The living believed that consuming the dead allowed emotional closure, allowing the spirit to move on. It was not horror, it was solace. Across these cases, one theme repeats. Cannibalism often appears in societies where the boundaries between body, memory, and identity are fluid, where the physical form is not sacred in itself, but rather a vessel that, when emptied, must be dealt with in a way that preserves harmony within the group. And if this is true for modern humans, who possess language, myth, and intricate systems of belief, then what might it suggest about the behaviour of our early ancestors? We cannot assume they understood death as we do, but we also cannot assume they understood it less. A tribe of Homo erectus or Homo antecessor likely had its own unspoken expectations, rules about danger, alliance, proximity, and grief. Social bonds existed, cooperation existed, shared child-rearing existed. These are the foundations of communal life, and within those foundations, behaviours that seem contradictory to us, killing, helping, consuming, protecting, could coexist without tension. Cannibalism in such a world may have been folded into the rhythms of life rather than standing apart from them. Not a violation, not a ceremony, not necessarily even a choice, simply one thread in the fabric of what it meant to survive together. And to unravel that thread, we must look not only at hunger but at power. Power, in early human groups, was rarely consolidated into thrones or crowns. It manifested in proximity, in silence, in who sat nearest the fire and who was permitted to speak, if they spoke at all. It lived in gesture, in glances exchanged over carcasses, in who received the choicest cuts and who was left with scraps. The archaeology of power leaves few fingerprints, but it shapes the residue of behaviour, what was done to whom and in what sequence. When we look at cannibalism through this lens, the question shifts. No longer merely why eat, but why that person? Forensic analysis of bones from prehistoric sites sometimes reveals selective processing. Certain bodies show extensive defleshing, while others are left untouched. In one notable example from the Grandolina cave site in Atapuerca, Spain, associated with Homo antecessor, researchers uncovered a series of juvenile remains bearing marks of butchery. The bones were cut, broken, and scraped in patterns indistinguishable from those found on animal carcasses in the same layer. These were not accidents, they were meals. But why children? Some researchers have suggested the victims were outsiders, captured individuals from rival bands, consumed not only for their caloric value but also to signal dominance or exclusion. Others argue the opposite, that these were internal members of the group, perhaps the young or the weak, sacrificed in periods of extreme scarcity. Still others leave room for symbolic meaning, suggesting that cannibalism may have served as a response to grief, or a form of primitive funerary rite. In each interpretation, power moves silently beneath the surface. To eat another being is to assert a certain right over their body. It is the ultimate act of possession, of reducing what was once autonomous to something that can be absorbed, and whether that act was driven by survival, ritual, or violence. The question of consent, so central to our modern ethics, was likely absent. What mattered was status, and in that status, identity. In small bands with limited resources and fragile cohesion, identity was a matter of life and death. Were you kin or not? Were you trusted or not? Did you fall within the circle of us, or hover on the outer rim? Cannibalism may have served as an extreme form of boundary setting, a way to draw that line in flesh. It may also have functioned, paradoxically, as a form of renewal. In some ethnographic records, particularly among hunter-gatherer societies facing crisis, cannibalistic rites are framed not as destruction, but as restoration. the body of the dead becomes a source of strength, of continuity, of group survival. What was one becomes many again, and in that act the social body is reaffirmed, even as the individual body is consumed. Was this the case in the lower Pleistocene? We do not know, but the bones whisper. Their marks are not random, they follow sequences, they speak of attention, of order, of decisions made in shadow. And if those decisions shaped who was consumed, they also shaped who was spared. In the quiet calculus of early human life, sparing someone could be as loaded a decision as taking them. In every tribe, every band, there are hierarchies, spoken or unspoken. Certain individuals carry knowledge, the location of water in a dry season, the technique to knap stone most precisely, the quiet skill of navigating conflict without bloodshed. Others carry youth, fertility, or strength, traits that promise a future. To spare is to recognize value. To consume is to reassign it. In the traces left behind, we see hints of these judgments. Some butchery sites show a preference for particular age groups. Others suggest a recurring pattern in which adult males are less likely to be targeted than juveniles or elderly individuals. These aren't the choices of desperate, poor, frenzied survivors acting without thought. They are patterns. Patterns imply criteria. Criteria imply culture. And culture, even at its most embryonic stage, is the first stirrings of morality. It is tempting to imagine early hominins as creatures dominated purely by instinct. But the archaeological record resists that simplicity. The presence of group burials, of repeated use of specific shelters, of fire maintained over long spans, these all suggest memory, continuity, the existence of social rules that, even if not codified in words, were deeply felt. And so we return to the tribe, not as a faceless mass, but as a community bound by difficult, often unspeakable choices. In extreme moments when famine deepens or conflict boils over, those rules are tested. Cannibalism may emerge at these thresholds, not as a failure of culture, but as its crucible. In choosing who to consume, the group reveals what it values. In choosing who to spare, it reveals what it hopes to become. This too is reflected in myths and oral histories passed down through surviving hunter-gatherer groups. Among the Kuru people, the consumption of the dead was interwoven with belief systems that explained the body not as an object, but as a legacy. Eating was remembering. In other traditions, cannibalism emerges as punishment, as cautionary tale, suggesting that even within those worlds, the act stood on the edge of what was acceptable. Perhaps that edge is where our ancestors lived most often, not in the certainty of ethics, but in the fog of necessity. They inhabited a moral landscape not yet mapped, where decisions were made not with clear outcomes in mind, but in service of something closer to survival's murmur. Keep going. Keep the group intact. Do what must be done. In that light, cannibalism may not have been the abyss of inhumanity we assume it to be. It may have been a ritual of last resort, a scar that allowed healing, a taboo not yet born, or perhaps born only later, when food was more plentiful and memory more clear. Because to judge the shadows of the tribe by the lights of our present is to miss the truth flickering at the heart of their fire. They were not us, and yet they were becoming. What we glimpse in the fragments, burned bones, split femurs, flaked tools stained with organic residue, is not simply violence, it is transformation. In the flicker of those early acts, the outlines of something recognizably human begin to emerge. Not because of kindness necessarily, but because of complexity. For the shadowed tribes of the lower Pleistocene, cannibalism may have been part of a wider toolkit of survival. Not only physical survival, but social endurance. Every choice made around a body, the decision to bury it, to burn it, to leave it, or to consume it, was an expression of belief, even if no words accompanied the act, and beliefs, over time, become structure. They become narrative. From this perspective, cannibalism doesn't only reside in the stomach. It resides in the stories a group tells about itself. Stories we cannot hear, but which we may glimpse in the silent echoes of behaviour. The structure of a hearth, the path of a cut, the careful placement of remains. Some sites suggest deliberate arrangement. Human bones found stacked or sorted by type. Skulls placed in niches. Limbs separated from torsos. These are not the signs of mindless consumption, but of selective action. And in that selectivity, a kind of thoughtfulness appears, a chilling one perhaps, but a mark of minds that were beginning to reckon with the implications of their choices. Could these have been early rituals? Could the consumption of kin have coexisted with mourning? In many modern cultures where endocannibalism is practiced, the act is not driven by hunger at all. It is driven by continuity, a belief that the essence of the person does not end with death, but is carried forward by the living. In this sense, eating the flesh is a form of intimacy, a commitment, a refusal to allow disappearance. It is possible that some early tribes saw death as a moment requiring action, not merely disposal. The body had to be transformed, dealt with, reintegrated into the world of the living. And for species without formal burial traditions, without carved headstones or spoken eulogies, the act of consumption may have served this role. It is a possibility we must consider carefully and with humility. Because to project horror onto every trace of cannibalism is to misunderstand the vast spectrum of human behaviour. Just as grief can be expressed with song or silence, so too can remembrance take many forms. We must not look away from the evidence. But neither must we see only what we fear. Cannibalism is not the whole story. It is one thread in the long tangled braid of early human life. A thread coloured by hunger, by belonging, by desperation, by meaning. In the firelight of a tribe long vanished, decisions were made that we will never fully comprehend. But in their echoes, we are offered a reflection, not of monsters, but of ancestors, wounded, resourceful, unsteady and slowly, step by step becoming human. There are bones that tell stories, and then there are bones that refuse to forget. In the quiet chambers of ancient caves beneath the layers of sediment and time, there are fragments that do more than mark the passing of life. They echo patterns, patterns that repeat, patterns that suggest intention. In the world of prehistoric archaeology, where randomness is often the rule, the recurrence of such signs is unsettling. It hints at something deliberate, and when those signs are on the bodies of children, cleaved and broken, their marrow carefully scooped out, we are forced to ask not just how, but why. Grandolina, nestled in the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain. There's a place where such questions linger like mist. It was here, in sediment dated to roughly 800,000 years ago, that archaeologists uncovered a scene frozen in the strata. Bone fragments, from at least 11 individuals, most of them young, bearing the unmistakable marks of butchery. Homo antecessor, the enigmatic hominin species to which these bones belonged, had not simply died here. They had been processed, skinned, dismembered, eaten. This wasn't a single episode. The evidence at Grandolina suggests recurrence. Cut marks followed familiar lines. Skull caps were removed in similar fashion. Long bones were split at consistent angles, optimized to reach the nutrient-rich marrow within. This was not an improvisation in a moment of famine. It was a practice, repeated across time, which means, at the very least, it had precedent. And precedent implies something more than survival. It implies a kind of memory. In the dust of this cave, Homo antecessor left more than tools. They left a record of behaviour, one that included cannibalism as part of the social landscape. Not a wild deviation, but a recognised, perhaps even accepted aspect of existence. That doesn't mean we understand it. Grandolina resists simple interpretation. The individuals consumed were primarily adolescents and children. This fact alone disrupts our assumptions. If cannibalism were purely nutritional, we might expect weaker, older individuals to be selected. Instead, it appears the young were targeted, repeatedly. Was this a matter of vulnerability, convenience, or does it reflect something more layered, perhaps even structured? Some have speculated that the victims may not have been members of the same group as their butchers, that this was not an act of internal necessity, but external aggression. In other words, violence between groups. The practice of capturing and consuming outsiders. If so, this complicates our vision of early hominin life. It implies the existence of tribal boundaries, of identity, of a sense of us versus them. A division so deeply felt that it could justify turning another person's body into food, But even that explanation doesn't fully close the circle, because beneath the cut marks and fractures lies something older than ideology. Need. The need to survive. The need to maintain cohesion within a group. The need, perhaps, to turn death into something useful. Something that, even in its horror, ensured that life would continue. For someone. For now. But when for now becomes a pattern, when it echoes across generations and leaves identical marks on identical bones, we are no longer looking at a desperate improvisation. We are looking at a behaviour woven into the rhythm of life, a custom, if not yet a culture. Across the ancient landscapes of Africa, thousands of kilometres from the Spanish hills of Atapuerca, similar rhythms have been uncovered. At the site of Kubifora in Kenya, where we began our journey, a single jawbone once unearthed bore tooth marks so clean, so measured, they were initially dismissed as scavenging. Only later did closer analysis reveal what the spacing of the punctures truly indicated. Another hominin, one with the jaw strength and bite pattern that matched the fossil record of Homo erectus. One who had not killed and discarded but chewed. These were not isolated acts. At multiple sites across eastern and southern Africa, bones, both human and animal, show evidence of a shared treatment. Marrow extraction, surface defleshing, controlled breakage along specific anatomical lines. Among the most haunting of these finds are those of juvenile remains. Small bones, brittle and porous, shattered and scraped with the same attention given to the leg of a gazelle. In the South African site of Swartkrans, known for its early hominin fossils and accumulation of tools, a fractured child's skull was found with stone tool incisions. These were not random gashes, they were methodical, and they corresponded to regions of muscle attachment, areas rich in protein. The child had been reduced to nutrition piece by piece, but if this shocks us, it also invites us to consider the broader context in which it happened. These regions were ecological battlegrounds, harsh climates, scarce resources, an ever-present threat from predators. Every calorie mattered. A body was not a symbol, it was a resource. And in a world where survival was a daily negotiation, the boundary between the dead and the consumed could become dangerously thin. Yet even here, in the grimmest corners of prehistory, we find something deeper than mere animal instinct. Because these acts were not always frantic. The bones were not simply torn apart, they were cleaned, prepared, broken with precision. There is a deliberateness that points to a cognitive awareness, not only of the act itself but of its consequences. The knowledge that a human body was different from an antelope's, and the decision to act anyway. This is where memory begins to take shape, not only in the marks left on the bone but in the choices repeated over time. The bones remember because they were handled with intention, because they were not accidents. What emerges is a portrait not of monsters but of minds. Minds bound to circumstance. Minds capable of cruelty, of calculation, of tradition. Minds that could hold a sharp edge in hand and bring it down across the curve of a child's femur, and in that moment choose survival over sanctity. A choice perhaps made more than once, made until it became memory, until it became practice. What we begin to see in these ancient sites is not a collection of isolated atrocities, but a constellation of behaviours, some eerily consistent across time and geography. Across continents and hundreds of thousands of years, the same methods appear. Skulls opened like bowls, long bones cracked longitudinally, joint surfaces cut to peel back muscle. These acts are not improvisations, they are techniques, passed down, perhaps not as formal instruction, but as patterns learned through observation and repetition. The child watches the adult, the youth practices the method, and one day, when famine comes or war breaks out, the hand doesn't hesitate. But what does it mean for a behaviour like this to be patterned? Is it merely adaptation? Or is it something more? A window into the social fabric of early hominin groups? When we consider that many of the cannibalized remains belong to children, this question grows sharper. In Grandolina and elsewhere, the demographic profile of the victims skews young. Children aged 6 to 12 are disproportionately represented. This does not appear random, nor can it be fully explained by availability or vulnerability. It points instead toward selection, a chilling thought, but one that, again, may be rooted less in sadism and more in cold arithmetic. In communities on the brink, where food is scarce and mobility limited, younger individuals offer high nutritional return with lower risk. Their deaths may not rupture group cohesion as violently as the loss of an adult provider. They may even be rationalized as necessary, and yet the implications remain grim. Because to select a child for such a fate requires a psychological shift, a detachment, or, alternatively, a normalization. Perhaps these acts were not shrouded in horror but cloaked in custom. If done often enough, if seen repeatedly, even the most appalling acts lose their edge. The unthinkable becomes familiar. Familiarity breeds function, and function becomes ritual. Which brings us to the heart of this chapter. Cannibalism not as anomaly, but as structure. A behaviour embedded in the bones of a community, not born of madness, but woven into life. This is what the archaeological record begins to whisper. Not screams, but silence. Not chaos, but method. And that method leaves traces. Scratches on bone, fractures in the skull, the careful stripping of tendons, the absence of burial, the absence of mourning. Instead, there is use. A body is transformed, not commemorated. Its parts scattered like tools, not remains. This is a different kind of memory, one that does not build tombs or light fires in honour, one that consumes and forgets, or perhaps, more darkly, one that consumes to remember. Because if these acts were ritual, if they were embedded in social practice, then the act of consumption may have carried meaning beyond nutrition. To eat another might not only be to survive them, but to keep them within, to make their strength your own, to transform death into continuity. And in this twisted calculus, even children might be seen not only as sacrifices, but as offerings. The notion is difficult to entertain, alien to modern sensibilities, yet the archaeological record continues to insist. What we see, again and again, is not randomness, but order. Not frenzy, but form. At Grandolina, the processing of human remains mirrors that of hunted animals in meticulous detail. Cut marks appear on the same anatomical locations, around joints, along muscle attachments, across ligaments, indicating a methodical sequence of dismemberment. Limbs are separated, flesh removed, bones cracked for marrow. Skulls are not simply smashed, but opened in controlled, deliberate ways. Even the disposal of the remains speaks volumes. Human bones are not buried apart or hidden away. They are discarded with the same disregard, or perhaps the same practicality, as the bones of deer, wild boar, and small mammals. This suggests no taboo, no reverence, and crucially, no distinction. In the minds of these early hominins, flesh was flesh. The source may have mattered less than the sustenance it provided. This doesn't mean the eaters were devoid of feeling, only that their framework of meaning diverged profoundly from our own. In their world, shaped by scarcity and sharpened by selection, morality as we know it may not have existed, or it may have taken forms we would not recognize, tribal, immediate, shaped by necessity more than abstract principle. Survival, not sanctity, defined value. But the persistence of these patterns raises a further question. Did this behaviour emerge independently in separate regions, or was it passed from group to group, generation to generation? In other words, was it innovation or inheritance? The presence of similar butchery techniques in both Europe and Africa, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, hints at cultural transmission. Not in the complex sense we associate with Homo sapiens, but in rudimentary, embodied ways. Observing, imitating, refining. A kind of proto-tradition, inscribed not in words or symbols, but in gestures. A lineage of hands, repeating motions taught by necessity and preserved by repetition. In this sense, the bones are not just archaeological data. They are records of action, of learning, of memory passed through practice, and like all cultural memory, they evolve. Techniques improve, choices become norms, norms become invisible, and when behaviour becomes invisible, it becomes the background of life, unquestioned, unexamined. So we begin to see these sites, not as scenes of horror, but as snapshots of a world with different rules. A world in which group cohesion may have depended not on empathy, but on shared behaviours, however brutal. In such a world, cannibalism might serve not just to nourish, but to bind, to reinforce boundaries, to assert dominance, to punish betrayal, or to mark transitions. Perhaps the body of the outsider was consumed to expel it. Perhaps the body of the kin was eaten to preserve it. Perhaps death itself was not an ending, but a transformation, facilitated by teeth, by fire, by the stone edge of a tool drawn along the curve of a bone. It is in these intimate, chilling moments that we confront the full weight of early human behaviour, not as monstrous deviation, but as adaptive logic. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the realisation that the people who did this were not so far removed from us. Homo antecessor may have stood differently, thought differently, but their biology was not alien. They walked upright, used tools, gathered in groups, protected their young, until they didn't. The line between kin and meat, it seems, could dissolve under pressure. The same hands that passed food to a child might one day become the same hands that prepared them for consumption. Sites like Grandolina do not tell us this directly. Fossils do not record intentions. Bones bear witness only to what happened, not why. But when taken together, across time and landscape, a picture begins to emerge, not of occasional panicked acts, but of socially integrated practices. And in these acts, whether driven by survival, ritual, or some murky blend of both, we see the shadows of thought, of choice, of cultural behaviour just beginning to take root. In Kenya's Turkana Basin, scattered bones suggest similar stories, cut marks etched with precision, spiral fractures on femurs, signs of fresh bone cracking. In South Africa's Swartkrans Cave, burnt bones and tool-scarred surfaces hint at controlled fire and systematic processing. In each case, there is no chaos, only routine. The bones remember not the screams or sorrow, but the habits, the repetition. The hands that learned and repeated until the act was second nature. We might be tempted to recoil, to separate ourselves from this past, with the comfort of morality, of time, of civilization. But the archaeological record does not permit such distance. These are not demons, they are ancestors, and their world, however strange, gave rise to ours. Their choices, forged under pressures we can scarcely imagine, echo into our biology, into the way our brains metabolize cooked food, into the social instincts that bind us, even, perhaps, into the moral reflexes that now make such acts feel obscene. But those moral reflexes had to begin somewhere, and perhaps they began here, in the recognition of pain, of kinship, of death. Perhaps it was precisely this grim familiarity with mortality, this raw intimacy with suffering, that laid the groundwork for compassion. Before we could sanctify the body, we had to violate it. Before we could mourn the dead, we had to destroy them. This is the paradox at the root of our humanity, that the same hands that crack skulls for marrow would one day paint them with ochre and place them gently in the ground. In this way, the bones do more than remember, they reveal. Not just who we were, but how far we've come, and how close still we remain to the edge. A line walked by our ancestors for millennia, a line cut deep into the stone, the soil, the fossilized silence of time. There is a moment, impossible to pin to any strata or carbon layer, when something invisible yet irreversible began to take hold in the minds of our ancestors, a flickering awareness, not of the self alone, but of the other. Long before the rise of laws or scriptures, before words carved the world into right and wrong, there must have been a shadow, thin as breath, curling in the minds of early hominins, a hesitation, a recognition, a grief. To eat another being is one thing, to eat one of your own. What changes in the silence that follows? The fossil record does not record emotion. Bones do not carry the echo of tears or the twitch of hesitation. And yet, biology does not bloom in a vacuum. Among the great apes, our cousins in the tangled web of primate lineage, we see the rootstock of empathy already branching. Chimpanzees cradle their dead. Bonobos comfort the distressed. Even Capuchins, with minds far less complex than ours, display fairness, sharing, protest. This is not morality in the human sense, not yet. But it is the soil from which morality may have grown. What must it have felt like for a mother Homo erectus to see her child in pain? Was there a wordless scream that shook through her chest, a primitive love that outpaced vocabulary? Could it be that the fire that once drove them to survive also began, subtly, to bend toward compassion, not as an ideal, but as an advantage? Among animals that depend on each other to endure the void between hunts and the long droughts of failure, would not those who could read each other's eyes, sense fear, soothe pain, would not they survive just a little longer? In this context, the roots of what we now call morality do not arrive as commandments etched in stone, but as murmurs in the nervous system, averted gazes, raised hairs, unspoken understandings that some acts rupture the invisible thread between individuals. That thread is not language, but something older, a look, a flinch, a pause that says, "This is wrong, even if I cannot tell you why." These prelinguistic shadows of emotion were not weak echoes of later, grander feelings. They were raw and wild, perhaps even more honest than our modern moral posturing. The ability to read pain in another's posture, to flinch at the sound of suffering, to recoil from the smell of blood when it carries the scent of someone you knew. These were not accidents. They were selected, honed, passed down not through words but through survival. Those who could feel a little more, hesitate a little longer, perhaps avoided the blade or gained the ally. But what happens when hunger silences those instincts? What happens when the child's body is no longer someone's son but meat? And what part of the mind, if any, resists? To answer that question, we must step deeper into a world without words, a world where communication flowed through gesture, posture, breath, and gaze. Early hominins did not speak, but they understood. They read intention in the angle of a shoulder, reassurance in the tilt of a head, threat in the tightening of a jaw. These signals were ancient long before language blossomed, inherited from primates who relied on subtle cues to navigate alliances and danger. In this environment, emotion was not a trait, it was a tool. Among chimpanzees, a raised arm can dissolve tension. A gentle touch can prevent a fight. Fear, empathy, and even forms of compassion are visible, measurable forces. If our ancestors shared these capacities, and there is every reason to believe they did, then the earlier social groups were bound not only by proximity, but by an intricate choreography of unspoken communication. A dominance display here, a grooming gesture there, a protective stance that shields a child without thought. Morality, in its earliest form, lived in these movements, in the care shown to the wounded, in the instinct to protect a vulnerable member of the group, in the discomfort that ripples through a crowd when violence crosses an invisible line. But invisible lines can bend. They bend under drought, under famine, under fear. When survival tightens its grip, the choreography breaks. Even in modern primates, cannibalism occasionally emerges under severe stress, an act driven not by malice, but by disruption. If our ancestors shared the same emotional architecture, then they also shared its fragility. The instinct to nurture could coexist with the instinct to consume. The same hand that reached to soothe could, under starvation's pressure, become the hand that wielded a stone blade. In this pre-language world, such contradictions were not resolved through debate or philosophy. They were resolved through reactions, through the collective emotional pulse of the group. Perhaps some individuals recoiled when a body was prepared for consumption. Perhaps others felt nothing. And perhaps a few, those shaped by desperation or habit, felt relief. But without words, these reactions did not crystallize into rules. They drifted in the social air, sensed but not codified. Over time, though, repeated patterns began to solidify. When certain acts provoke stress in the group, fear, avoidance, agitation, they may have become risky to perform. The cost of disturbing social cohesion might outweigh the caloric value of a body. Conversely, if a group consistently endured scarcity, cannibalism could become normalized. What the bones record as patterns may reflect these early negotiations. Primitive social norms formed not through language but through emotional tide. It is in this space between instinct and intention that the seeds of taboo were sown. A gesture of recoil, a protective stance over a fallen member, a low, warning sound. These were the first laws, not spoken, not carved, but felt. And slowly, across thousands of years, they began to shape the way our ancestors understood harm, long before they had words to name it. And yet, the absence of words did not mean the absence of meaning. Early hominins, just like modern primates, were born into a web of social instincts that shaped how they behaved, how they cooperated, how they responded to threat, and how they treated one another. These instincts weren't just useful, they were essential. In the brutal ecology of the lower Pleistocene, an isolated individual was often a dead one. It was not brute strength alone that secured survival, but the ability to stay within the group, to belong. Belonging came at a cost. It required restraint, deference, and above all, a sensitivity to the moods and needs of others. Over time, these sensitivities became the substrate of what we now call proto-morality. Long before any hominin could articulate a rule, they could enforce one. Social emotions, shame, guilt, pride, jealousy, are not inventions of culture, but deeply rooted adaptive mechanisms. They align individual behavior with group cohesion. A mother who recoils from harming her offspring survives to raise another. A juvenile who respects dominance avoids punishment. A band that punishes betrayal is more likely to stay united. But what does this look like in the fossil record? The bones themselves cannot blush. They carry no chemical residue of remorse, yet some clues shimmer faintly through the ages. We find group burials in later prehistory, bodies arranged together, protected. We find individuals who lived with disabling injuries, suggesting care by others. Even in early sites, there are hints. A broken femur that healed, meaning the injured person was not abandoned. These are not the acts of pure instinct. They point to something social, something remembered. And then there is the opposite. Bones stripped, broken, boiled, defleshed not with surgical precision but with methodical intent. These signs, found in caves, in shelters, at hearths, speak of acts that break the pattern. They challenge our assumptions. Why would a community turn on its own? Why would the social bond fracture so completely? Desperation is one answer. Crisis shatters norms. But even desperation follows a script. If cannibalism was repeated, patterned, normalized, then the social calculus must have changed. Perhaps the line between us and them was thinner than we assume. Perhaps a rival group member or a deformed infant was not considered one of us. Perhaps kinship, like morality, had not yet been carved into absolutes. Who was mourned and who was meat may have depended on shifting, fragile emotional maps. Without language, those maps were passed through feeling, not reason. They pulsed through the limbic system, the mammalian inheritance of our deepest brain structures. They were enforced not by law, but by the group's collective unease. And from that unease, a new kind of order began to emerge. Not just rules of survival, but rules of meaning. A primitive scaffold of ethics, flickering like firelight across the faces of beings who could not speak, but could feel when something had gone too far. And from that flicker of feeling, of discomfort, of grief, of quiet resistance, something ancient and transformative began to stir. A slow and fragile awareness that certain actions fractured more than bones. They fractured bonds. They stirred unease in the group, a kind of tension that could not be named but was remembered. These moments didn't just pass, they lingered. And over generations, such lingering impressions began to coalesce into social gravity. A force that pulled individuals toward a rough sense of right, not because they understood morality as we do, but because groups that honoured emotional safety outlasted those that collapsed into fear and chaos. This gravity of feeling gave rise to proto-norms, the ancestors of our moral codes. Not commandments, but tendencies. Not language, but pattern. In primate troops today, the death of an infant often draws collective mourning. Low cries, withdrawn behaviour, a quieting of the group. We see signs of recognition, of shared loss. These responses are not rational, they are deeply emotional. So too with early humans. Perhaps the death of a familiar group member brought silence. Perhaps touching the corpse was done only with hesitation, or perhaps a bold individual violated that quiet, cutting through the taboo, and perhaps others turned away. These are the invisible roots of justice, not fairness in the abstract, but gut-deep reactions that influenced who got trusted, who was shunned, who received help in the lean season. Pre-language morality was not a system, it was a survival strategy, embedded in the chemistry of bonding and aversion. To do harm to another was to disturb the emotional fabric, and in doing so, one risked losing protection, comfort, belonging. But there is another side. Group loyalty can breed exclusion just as easily as care. The same bonds that nurtured empathy could also foster cruelty, especially toward outsiders. It's possible that early cannibalism wasn't random or desperate, but selective, that enemies killed in conflict were eaten as a way to erase them from memory, or worse, to incorporate their strength. This isn't just speculation. In some modern cultures with long traditions of ritual cannibalism, consuming the body of a fallen enemy was seen not as grotesque, but as sacred. Such practices don't emerge from evil, they emerge from meaning. They require a shared understanding, however primitive, of what death is, what bodies are, and what acts are allowable under extreme conditions, and they point toward a growing capacity not just to react, but to justify. A killing becomes acceptable because the victim was a rival. An act of cannibalism becomes permissible because hunger demanded it, or because it honoured the fallen. This is the edge where proto-morality meets proto-culture. A line between impulse and custom, and standing at this threshold were beings who looked much like us, who nursed their young, who mourned their dead, who carved meat from bones and watched each other watching. They didn't yet have ethics, but they had reactions. And in those reactions, morality had begun to take root, not in words, but in the trembling silence that followed an unthinkable act. In that silence, something profound was forming, not through deliberate thought, but through felt experience. A child watching an elder hesitate before taking a final bite of meat that came from one of their own kind. A glance shared between two individuals as a body was dragged not to be buried but to be butchered. These moments of tension, of subtle dissonance accumulated, and in the accumulation they shaped behaviour. Not through punishment or commandments, but through something older, unease, mimicry, the urge to align with those around you. Across generations, this emotional inheritance deepened. We see it echoed in modern hunter-gatherers who use silence as correction, whose children learn not through lectures but through observation and disapproval. A frown, averted eyes, the withholding of touch, these are tools of social calibration far more ancient than language. They likely existed in the time of Homo erectus, perhaps even earlier. By the time symbolic culture emerged, by the time we find ochre, beads, burials, these proto-moral instincts had already been shaping minds for hundreds of thousands of years. What's striking is how morality appears to precede meaning. That is, the emotional contours of right and wrong existed before those values could be named. Long before humans carved stories into stone or painted animals on cave walls, they were navigating invisible social landscapes, ones etched in body language, in group dynamics, in the quiet pressure to conform or be cast out. These early social pressures formed the foundation upon which all later systems of ethics would be built. In this light, cannibalism becomes not just a shocking act, but a lens into the early architecture of moral feeling. When did it cross the line? When did someone say, or rather show, this is not okay? Was it after a child was taken? Was it when the old and frail were no longer protected but consumed? Or did it begin with a single act that left a lasting stain, passed down not in stories but in behaviour modified by discomfort? These are questions we cannot answer with certainty, but the fossil record whispers suggestions, the repeated patterns, the selectivity, the absence of butchered children at some sites, the abundance at others, the difference between bones cracked in famine and bones arranged with care. These clues hint at a moral spectrum, not an absolute, but a shifting terrain influenced by hunger, fear, affiliation, and memory. What we are left with is a vision of early humanity not as brutish or savage, but as deeply emotional, profoundly social, and gradually awakening to something greater than instinct. Before we had words for wrong, we had reactions. Before there were taboos, there was sorrow. Before morality was taught, it was felt. In the body, in the tribe, in the heartbeats shared around a fire, when someone did what should not have been done. This is where morality began, not in laws but in looks, not in arguments but in instincts. And from those instincts, shaped by hunger and horror alike, the path toward human conscience slowly emerged. There are certain images that haunt the human imagination across continents and centuries: bones scraped of flesh, skulls cracked open, the unmistakable suggestion that one body had been transformed into nourishment for another of its own kind. These images repel us. But have you ever wondered why? What is it in the human mind that recoils, not from death itself, nor from violence alone, but from this particular intimacy of consumption? Across time, this revulsion has remained a nearly universal constant, and yet its roots run far deeper than mere social training. To understand why cannibalism unsettles us so profoundly, we must look inward, into the very architecture of the brain, and further still, into the deep evolutionary scripts etched into our flesh. In the folds of the human cortex, within the tangled web of synapses shaped by millions of years of adaptation, disgust emerges as one of the oldest guardians. Long before morality was codified, long before language gave shape to ethics, disgust served as a primitive filter, protecting the body from decay, infection, and contamination. It was not always rational. It did not need to be. It was effective. The scent of rot, the sight of filth, the texture of spoiled meat, all these things triggered an ancient alarm that silenced curiosity and sharpened caution. But somewhere along the evolutionary spiral, this simple reflex was recruited into a more complex social role. Disgust became moralized. It was no longer just about what was edible, it became about what was acceptable. What does it mean when the body of a fellow human triggers this alarm? And more unsettling still, what happens when it doesn't? In psychological studies today, researchers observe that visual cues of cannibalism evoke some of the strongest physiological reactions in test subjects: dilated pupils, suppressed appetite, altered heart rhythms. These reactions are more intense than those provoked by depictions of murder, illness, or even the corpses of animals. It's as if the brain, upon recognizing its own likeness as prey, initiates a deeper revolt, one not just against consumption, but against identification. This is the mirror, the unbearable reflection. To see the self as food is to witness the collapse of the boundaries that define personhood. Why does this boundary matter so deeply? Perhaps because it is the boundary from which all meaning flows. In anthropology, the eating of one's own kind is rarely viewed in isolation. It is not merely a culinary act. It is a symbolic transgression. It violates the perceived order of the universe. It brings together what must remain apart: the eater and the eaten, the self and the other, the subject and the object. Civilizations across the globe, even those that practiced ritual cannibalism, constructed elaborate frameworks to contain its power, codes, rites, taboos. These were not designed simply to prevent chaos. They were rituals of acknowledgement. They told the participants, what you're doing is not normal and must not become so. But beneath the chanting and the ceremony, what truly echoed in the firelight was the question: what makes us human, if not the refusal to devour ourselves? To answer that, we must turn to history, not the distant fossil record this time, but the cultural archives of civilization. Across millennia, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the icy plains of the Inuit, cannibalism appears again and again, sometimes hidden, sometimes ritualized, sometimes desperate. And yet, across these vast cultural landscapes, one thread remains curiously consistent: the existence of taboo. A taboo is more than a law. It is a boundary drawn not just by society but by belief. Taboos carry the weight of the sacred and the dangerous intertwined. To break one is not merely to err, but to unravel something fundamental. In cultures that practiced cannibalism, it was rarely casual. Often it was framed through myth or ceremony, To eat an enemy was to absorb his power. To consume a loved one was to carry them into the self eternally. And always, there were rules. Who could be eaten, under what conditions, with what words spoken and silences kept. Even where the flesh was consumed, it was never just meat. It was meaning. These customs reveal something extraordinary. The horror of cannibalism may be primal, but it is not simple. It is not a binary reaction, as if the mind recoils instinctively in all contexts. Instead, disgust bends. It is shaped by culture, by context, by intention. The same act that would repel in one village might sanctify in another. This malleability of horror tells us something vital about the nature of morality. It is not fixed, but flexible. Not absolute, but adaptive. And yet, the deeper question remains. Why would a practice so heavily regulated, so freighted with symbolism and dread, emerge in the first place? Why would any culture cross the threshold of revulsion? Survival is one answer, but it is not the only one. In many cases, cultural cannibalism was not driven by famine or desperation. It was driven by meaning. In the rituals of endocannibalism, the respectful consumption of deceased kin, we glimpse a form of mourning that defies our modern categories. Where today we bury or burn, there were times when to eat the body was to honour it, to reunite what death had divided. It was not an act of domination, but of remembrance. And still, to modernise, it horrifies. That horror is worth pausing over. Not to dismiss it, but to question it. What is it that horrifies us? Truly? Is it the act itself? Or is it the recognition that the line between us and them, between now and then, between human and animal, may be thinner than we wish to believe? The mirror does not lie. It shows us not only our present, but our past. And in that reflection, we see not monsters, but ancestors. Ancestors who, like us, struggled with death, meaning, and the strange intimacy of flesh. And in that struggle, something remarkable began to form, not merely in rituals or tools, but in the wet circuitry of the brain itself. Neuroscience has illuminated the ancient roots of disgust, showing that the aversion to cannibalism is not just cultural, but physiological. Within the folds of the insular cortex, a region deep in the brain, resides the machinery of repulsion. It responds to rot, to disease, to bodily fluids, and especially to the idea of eating human flesh. This isn't random, it is evolutionary. In evolutionary terms, disgust is a defense. It shields the body from pathogens and the group from contagion, but more than that, it is a teacher. Long before language evolved, disgust marked the boundaries of behaviour. It shaped what could be touched, tasted, trusted. And over time, it grew beyond food into feeling, into moral disgust. The same neural systems that flare at spoiled meat now flare at betrayal, cruelty, injustice. Disgust taught us not just how to eat, but how to live together. And so, in the shadow of cannibalism, we glimpse the birth of morality. This doesn't mean that revulsion is always right. The history of human prejudice is littered with misplaced disgust, directed at the other, the foreign, the unfamiliar. But it does mean that the disgust we feel at cannibalism is not arbitrary. It is a product of memory, individual, cultural and genetic, a memory that whispers from deep time that to eat one's own is to cross a boundary too profound to ignore. And yet, that boundary has been crossed, repeatedly, in moments of famine, in ritual, in war, in reverence, in madness. Each time, the line was drawn and redrawn. This tells us something else. Disgust is powerful, but it is not impervious. Under pressure, social, psychological, existential, it can be overridden. We are creatures of instinct, yes, but also of reflection. The same brain that recoils can also rationalize. The same hand that shakes with revulsion can steady itself in the name of belief, or desperation, or duty. In this way, cannibalism becomes more than an act. It becomes a mirror of what we will do to survive, what we will do for meaning, what we are when all else is stripped away. But there is one final twist in this reflection. For as revolted as we are by the idea of cannibalism, we are also, in some part of the human psyche, fascinated by it. It lingers at the edges of myth, of horror stories, of folklore and legend. From vampires to wendigos to tales of shipwreck and siege, the spectre of human flesh consumed haunts our narratives. It terrifies, but it also compels. Why? Perhaps because, in some deep ancestral layer of the mind, we recognize it, not as desire, but as memory. A trace from a time when the world was colder, darker, and more desperate. When our ancestors stood at the edge of survival and made choices we now struggle to imagine. That struggle in part defines us. For it is not only the act of cannibalism that shapes the narrative, it is the reaction to it. Across millennia, across cultures, cannibalism has been ringed with ritual, remorse, and mythology. The more human societies advanced, the more that revulsion deepened. With language, with memory, and with myth, we began to encode our fear of the act into the very stories we told about ourselves. Take, for instance, the role of cannibalism in ancient mythologies. In Greek lore, the Titan Cronus devoured his own children to prevent them from overthrowing him, a monstrous act that symbolized the fear of power devouring innocence. In the epic tales of the Amauri, as in those of many other peoples, consuming the body of an enemy was both a gesture of dominance and a spiritual act, intended to absorb mana or life force. And in the stories of European folk tales, cannibals often lurked at the fringes of the forest, embodying the fear of wilderness, hunger, and the untamed aspects of the self. What these narratives reveal is not just a cultural taboo, but a deep symbolic weight. Cannibalism was not simply a crime of the body, it was an affront to the soul. To consume another was to transgress the invisible threads that bind a society together: kinship, compassion, continuity. It was not merely that the flesh was eaten, it was that the personhood within the flesh was defiled, and yet paradoxically it is precisely this transgression that gives cannibalism its symbolic potency. The act becomes a warning. A marker of how far one can fall or be pushed before something essential is lost. In this way, it becomes more than horror. It becomes instruction, a dark guidepost pointing to the edge of the human map. By the time early civilizations began to codify law and ritual, cannibalism had already been seared into the collective memory as one of the ultimate taboos. The Code of Hammurabi, the laws of Manu, and other ancient legal texts rarely needed to address it explicitly. Its horror was already assumed. In the rare moments it occurred, it was treated not merely as a crime, but as an abomination, a thing to be purged, exiled, or ritually cleansed. But again, the exceptions matter. Among certain tribes in Papua New Guinea, the Fore people practiced endocannibalism, not as an act of violence, but of love. When a family member died, their flesh was consumed so that their essence would remain within the living. It was a gesture of continuity, not cruelty, and yet it had consequences. The ritual spread a neurological disease, kuru, through the community, death by love. This is the paradox at the heart of cannibalism. It is neither solely monstrous nor solely desperate. It is not only horror, it is also meaning. And in our reaction to it, we see the evolution of morality, of identity, and of the sacred. In this mirror, the reflection is not clean. It flickers, it stares back. Because in the end, cannibalism is not simply about the devouring of flesh. It is about the collapse of boundaries between self and other, between instinct and taboo, between survival and morality. And that is what haunts us most. It is not only the act, but what it reveals, that beneath layers of culture and conscience, the ancient drives still hum quietly, shaped by the landscapes of our deepest past. Neuroscience today sheds new light on this discomfort. Functional imaging reveals that the very thought of cannibalism activates networks in the brain associated with both moral disgust and physical repulsion. The insular cortex, which governs taste and visceral sensation, fires alongside the anterior cingulate cortex, which manages social judgment. In short, our brains react to cannibalism as both a violation of the body and of society. It is felt in the gut and judged by the conscience, a full-bodied shudder. And yet, for all this disgust, the fascination remains. We cannot look away. Documentaries, myths, horror films, and even humour return again and again to the cannibal. Hannibal Lecter dines with elegance. Zombies swarm with mindless hunger. The modern imagination, like the prehistoric hearth, still glows with the echoes of this taboo. Why? Because the cannibal, more than a monster, is a distorted reflection of ourselves. In their choices, unimaginable to us now, we glimpse the margins of human experience: starvation, exile, ritual, grief, and power. And by naming it as horror, by pushing it to the dark corners of our stories, we attempt to confine it, to make it other, to forget that we once stood closer to that line, but the bones remember, the jawbones split by stone tools, the burn marks in ancient hearths, the bite-shaped impressions on ribs buried deep in Pleistocene earth. These are not fantasies, they are facts, and though we wrap them in layers of ethics, narrative, and modern delicacy, they persist, they whisper. To turn away from them entirely would be to lose something valuable, not because we condone the act, but because understanding it reminds us how far we've come, and how fragile that distance might be. In famine zones, in collapsed civilizations, in places where social bonds erode, history shows us that these ancient behaviours can re-emerge, not as choices, but as last resorts, as instincts shorn of protection. So perhaps the revulsion we feel is not merely learned, it is earned, forged in the crucible of survival, empathy, and trial. It is the mark of a species that remembers where it came from, and chooses, again and again, to step away from the edge. In the mirror of horror, we see not only what we fear, we see what we value: life, kinship, mercy, and in that, perhaps, lies the clearest evidence that we are still becoming human. The final bones lie buried, but the story they tell continues, quiet, unsettling, and deeply, unmistakably ours. There is a moment, buried beneath the layers of prehistory, when something more than survival began to take root in the minds of our ancestors. Not a tool, not a fire, not even a word, but a feeling, a strange, unshakable weight that settled in the chest when looking upon the body of another. Something that whispered, "This could have been me." In that quiet realization, somewhere between hunger and restraint, between instinct and hesitation, we find a doorway not only to morality, but to what we now dare to call humanity. But what is humanity when stripped of its monuments, its scriptures, its laws? What remains when only the body and the choice stand between life and memory? For centuries the fossil record seemed silent on the matter. Bones spoke of tools and trauma, of butchery and burned marrow, but rarely of intent. Yet the more we studied the patterns, repeated marks, missing skull caps, flayed thighs, split ribs, the more it became impossible to ignore that some ancient choices were not made in frenzy, but in deliberation. This was not the madness of beasts. This was the calculus of consciousness. And with it came something far more disturbing than horror: recognition. Because to dismember another is not merely to destroy a body, it is to dissect a mirror. What then does it mean when a species begins to understand that it is not alone in its mind, not alone in its fear, and not alone in its hunger? Empathy, we know, is not unique to us. Among elephants, dolphins, and certain primates, there is mourning, cooperation, even sacrifice. But ours took a different shape. It grew alongside language and the story, tools that do not dig into flesh, but into memory. And memory, once shaped by words, becomes more than a trace. It becomes a legacy. Yet long before the first sentence was spoken, long before the first grave was dug, that legacy began in silence. A mother watching her child starve, a young male returning from the hunt with nothing but shame in his hands, a group pressed against the brink staring at the body of one of their own, not yet rotted, still warm. The decision that followed, whether to consume or to bury, whether to forget or to remember, was not just about food, it was about what kind of creature they were becoming. In those decisions lies the uncarved soul of our species. Not the morality we write in stone or inscribe in scripture, but the morality that trembled in the gut before there were words to name it. The ancient hesitation before a taboo was even born. That flicker of resistance, so small, so fragile, was the ember from which all our temples, all our laws, and all our tears would one day be drawn. But was it enough to stop the knife? And if it wasn't, Does that make those ancestors less human? Or more? What does it mean to feel revulsion at an act your blood once condoned? Perhaps it means we've evolved not only in body but in awareness, that the bones beneath our skin have learned to hold memory, and not just structure. And memory, when carried across enough generations, becomes something larger than recollection. It becomes identity. The same hands that once split skulls to scoop out the nutrient-rich brain would later sculpt figurines, bury the dead with ochre and flowers, and trace symbols on cave walls in flickering firelight. The hands did not change, but the mind behind them did. What changed was not our capacity for violence, but our relationship to it. What changed was the ghost that lingered after the act, the quiet internal echo that asked, "Was this right?" And so we arrive at a curious threshold, a place where horror and introspection coexist, where cannibalism, though long buried under layers of taboo, still beckons from the deep time of our ancestry, not as a monstrous aberration, but as a chapter, ugly, vital, and instructive, a mirror in which we see not only what we were, but what we might still be under the right or wrong conditions. Because the truth is, cannibalism did not disappear because we grew too noble. It receded because we began to tell stories about it. Stories that warned, that remembered, that judged. And in that act of storytelling, we painted the line between man and monster. The fragility of that line is unsettling. It suggests that humanity is not a destination, but a practice, something we must continuously choose, even in the face of desperation. That choice, made and remade across millennia, is what carved morality into the marrow of our kind. It wasn't carved by gods or decrees, but by the cold logic of survival meeting the warmth of recognition. The recognition that the other, once a rival or a resource, might also be a reflection. Even now, in our well-lit homes and civilized rituals, echoes of that ancient tension remain. We feel it in our myths, the ogres and wendigos, the witch's stew and the werewolf's hunger. We feel it in the way we recoil from spoiled meat, in the uneasy fascination we have with true crime and survival stories. Something in us remembers. Something in us still whispers. We came from a place where the boundary was thin, where the decision to eat or not to eat was not symbolic, it was survival. But we've carried that memory forward, and in doing so we've turned it into a guide, not to shame, but to humility, to remember what we are capable of, not just at our best, but at our worst, and to let that memory soften us, not harden us, to remind us that the story of being human is not the story of perfection, but of struggle, of trying to be more than instinct, even when instinct claws at the door. This is where morality takes root, not in the absence of darkness, but in the presence of it, a fragile bloom rising out of soil soaked in necessity. When early hominins turn their tools inward, when they crack the bones of their own kind and place survival above kinship, they may not have paused to wonder. But somewhere along the line, someone did. Someone felt the weight not just in their stomach, but in their chest. A stillness, a hesitation, a flicker of something that would one day become guilt, or sorrow, or reverence. That flicker may have been the beginning of everything, not because it stopped the behaviour outright, but because it introduced ambiguity. It asked the question, what are we doing? And later, who are we becoming? Prehistoric cannibalism then becomes more than a horror. It becomes a mile marker. A place where we can look back and see how far we've walked, barefoot and bloodied, toward the light of something gentler. It's easy to judge the past, to place ourselves above it with modern certainty. But the deeper truth is more humbling. We did not inherit morality ready-made. We forged it in fire, in hunger, in the unspeakable. It is not a crown we wear, but a path we walk. And so, the viewer, the listener, the dreamer in the dark has come full circle, from curiosity through confusion and discomfort into quiet reckoning. This story was never about condemning our ancestors. It was about understanding them, and through them understanding ourselves. Their bones speak, not only of violence, but of change. The same hands that struck with stone could later pass a child between them with tenderness. The same mouths that once tore into flesh would one day speak names, sing lullabies, mourn the dead. That transformation, the slow, uneven, often tragic evolution from survival to meaning, is what this journey reveals. We are not separate from the past. We are its latest breath, its living memory. And while the bones may be silent now, buried beneath layers of ashen time, their story lingers. Not to haunt us, but to hold us. To say, this too was human. This too shaped what you are. There's a strange peace in that. A reassurance that even our darkest moments are part of the human mosaic. That to be human is not to be perfect. It is to wrestle with the imperfect and choose, again and again, to rise, to draw the line, to become more than what we were, even if only by a fraction. Because in the end, that fraction matters. It is the sliver of moonlight in the cave, the pause before the strike, the tear that falls without language. It is what makes us human, not the hunger, but the hesitation, not the silence, but the story we choose to tell afterward. And now you've heard that story, not through words etched in stone or sung through myth, but from the very marrow of our species. You've walked among those who had no names, who built no temples, who left behind no prayers but the ones carved into the surface of bone. And yet, they are still with us. Their decisions, their fears, their brief moments of grace, they echo in the structure of our empathy, in the rituals we hold dear, in the boundaries we swear never to cross. It's tempting to frame this story as one of triumph, to say, we no longer do this, therefore we have won. But that would be too easy. Because buried in the earth and within ourselves is the truth that the line between humanity and inhumanity is not fixed. It must be drawn again with each generation, and sometimes within each soul. We see this, even now, in how societies treat the vulnerable, in how easily desperation can return, in how memory, both personal and collective, can erode when not tended to. The prehistoric cannibal was not a monster. They were cold, afraid, starving, and human. And that's what makes their story so essential. It is not alien. It is a version of us, stripped of illusion, making impossible choices in impossible conditions. And yet, here we are, telling their story by firelight once again. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but for understanding, for remembrance, for humility. Because if we are to carry forward what it truly means to be human, we must carry not just our advancements and discoveries, but also our regrets, our failings, our darkest hours. These are not stains to be hidden. They are lessons carved deep, cautions whispered through the long corridors of time. And perhaps that is where our morality begins, not in avoiding darkness, but in remembering it, in listening to the bones and answering not with judgment, but with grace. With the recognition that the line between past and present, between horror and hope, runs directly through us. We are the continuation of that long, aching effort to choose kindness even when we don't have to, especially when we don't have to. So if there's one truth this journey has offered, it's this. Being human is not a state of arrival. It is a process, an aspiration, a discipline. It is not guaranteed by birth, but earned by the choices we make when no one is watching. When survival whispers one path, and something deeper, quieter, calls us to another. That voice, however faint, is still speaking. You've heard it tonight. And now, as we step back from the ancient campsites and firelit shadows, as the crack of marrow and the silence of vanished tongues fade into stillness, we are left with something subtle, yet enduring, a shift in how we see ourselves, not merely as descendants of great inventors or explorers, but as survivors of complexity, of ambiguity, of moments when survival demanded everything, and still something in us tried to remember how to care. The story of prehistoric cannibalism does not offer comfort, but it offers something better, perspective, the kind born not of simple condemnation, but of presence. You were there, on the open plains of Kubifora, beneath the cliffs of Grandolina, beside the hearths where smoke tangled with silence. You watched our ancestors in their lowest hours, not to excuse them, but to witness the shape of what we came from. And what did you find? That human nature is not a fixed inheritance. It is fluid. It bends under pressure. It breaks sometimes. But it also reforms, rebuilds, learns. From stone blades to shared firelight, from the first spark of empathy to the quiet tug of remorse, we see that being human is not about perfection. It's about the capacity to reflect, to remember, and to try again. This story is not one of despair. It's one of resilience, even in the face of unspeakable choices. Our species did not just endure hardship, it emerged from it changed. Slowly, awkwardly, but profoundly. Over time, something began to bloom between individuals. Shared glances, protective gestures, the refusal to harm even when it was possible. The building blocks of morality, unspoken but unmistakable. You are the inheritor of that slow moral revolution, the proof that a species capable of such desperation is also capable of compassion, not by erasing what came before, but by facing it, absorbing it, and choosing something better. Tonight you've sat with the dead. You've walked with the frightened, the starving, the forgotten, and you've listened, not to the noise of judgment, but to the still, unsettling echo of recognition. Because the oldest questions are never really about the past. They're about us now. What do we do when no one is watching? What will we remember when hunger returns? What stories will we pass on, not just of our triumphs, but of the times we nearly lost ourselves? This chapter closes not with certainty, but with continuity. The long thread of becoming human stretches on, and as you drift now into rest, know that the darkness behind you has been faced. The bones have spoken, and you, quiet, thoughtful, enduring, have listened. That is what it means to be human. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for walking this long path with us, through dust and marrow, memory and firelight, tracing the outline of what it has meant to survive as one of us. If this story offered you a moment of stillness, a whisper of wonder, or a sense of connection that reached across time, then we are deeply grateful for your presence tonight. I wonder what fragment will stay with you from this journey. A shape in the ash, a gesture by firelight, a silence that meant more than words, whether it was the image of marrow split by deliberate hands, the quiet echo of children's bones at Grandolina, or the haunting realization that disgust itself was carved by history. These fragments are what connect us, echoes of what it means and meant to be human. If one of those stayed with you, I hope you'll share it in the comments below, not for applause, but as a quiet offering. These reflections are what build our little circle of thinkers, puzzling through deep time together. If you'd like to join us for the next descent into hidden history, more tales of shadowed bones, ancient choices, and the soft breath of meaning, please consider liking, subscribing, or simply returning when the night calls again. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,